if my husband snores in the background.
No problem. Okay, so thank you for coming onto the channel, Judy, and I really appreciate it. I've been looking forward to this for a few weeks actually, but we
Right.
finally were able to set a date and a time and everything. And thank you for coming, and welcome aboard. And please introduce yourself for people that are somewhat new to you and your story.
Okay, thanks, Paul. I'd say about half the world is somewhat new to our story, which is why we had such a big trouble getting connected here. So I'm Judy Mikovitz, PhD, the Judy A. Mikovitz, PhD. That's not my married name. I got married 20 years ago this year when I was 42, and most of my career, at that point, I had moved into industry. But at any rate, I started my career in 1980. As soon as I graduated, within a month of my graduation from the University of Virginia, I accepted a position as a lab technician. I graduated from the University of Virginia with a degree in chemistry and a specialization in biology. So in 1976, when I started that program, there was no such thing as biochemistry. So that I had to get a Bachelor of Arts. I have a BA in chemistry with a specialization in biology. And so that degree got me a job as a natural products chemist in a program called the fermentation program of the National Cancer Institute in Frederick, Maryland. So fermentation is obviously like making beer. So what was my first job there? It was to purify, to grow in a fermentation in a large vat with cells to grow and purify interferon alpha, type 1 interferon that's made, all animals, mammals, humans have type 1 interferon, an extensive immune antiviral pathway. So we purified that, and it's always a team. So you never work alone. And so we purified that material, and the royal we, the larger we, is the rest of the National Cancer Institute actually used that clinically in several different cancers, but at the time it was a curative therapy for a leukemia called hairy cell leukemia. So that I had that job in fermentation chemistry where I made several drugs, adriamycin from plants. They call it the red devil for breast cancer. I made a lot of different jobs, toyocamycin, sangivamycin. I made antibiotics. My job is I was a purification natural products chemist. Also did a large purification of the first human cancer-causing virus, HTLV1, human T-cell leukemia virus.
Just to interject, did you ever get introduced to Dr. Faber? No, you know who I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Daver. Yeah. All right.
Yeah, I was probably, so one of the things that's difficult for most people understanding this story is, how collaborative science is, how collaborative medicine is. So as soon as I purified, and learned of the first human cancer causing retrovirus, that was called HTLV1, human T-cell leukemia virus at the time. Now they call it human T-cell lymphoma virus because they know it's associated with any number of autoimmune diseases, and of course more than just that adult T-cell leukemia, which was the patient population from which it was isolated. Because when you have the frank disease, the leukemia, by the time your immune system gets that far into dysfunction, then you then it's easy to isolate the virus. And what's interesting about that, so I purified that virus as a part of my job in the fermentation program, but I didn't meet the discoverer, the person who originally isolated that virus and purified that virus, Dr. Frank Rossetti, who did that along with Bernie Poise, his postdoc at the time, and they did that in Bob Gallo's lab, which was not in Frederick. It was in the National Cancer Institute in Bethesda, Maryland, which is about a 50-mile drive. So
it's amazing, because when I was taking my cancer class with it was Dr. Throw at Harvard. Mm-hmm. We were going over how they were doing the purification of Sark.
Right.
and you know, with in Weinberg's lab.
Correct. And
Yeah.
of course, you know, even in this story, Peter Duisberg comes into the story because Peter Duisberg was one of the team members who originally did SARC as the oncogene. So I don't know what the best word is for, you know, was discoverer maybe of the SARC oncogenes and at least that's the way I remember the story. But people say, oh, even today, people say, well, Judy, you know, Peter Duisberg, you know, and I'm, you know, and what people don't realize is I'm between 22 and 25 years old. I'm a technician. I'm a scientist. I purify things, and I supply them. We were literally hired guns. I see that on your shared screen. We were literally hired guns in the fermentation program. We made whatever the NCI or the NIAID asked us to make. That's what we did. And so it's like, so when people say, well, did you work directly with Tony Fauci? Well, no, because, but I was the guy that made the things the programs asked me to make. And so, yes, yes, because that's how your salary is paid. So we were hired guns. And throughout my career, you know, even the lab I directed in 1999 to 2000 and won the lab of antiviral drug mechanisms, that laboratory was a hired gun, whether for pharmaceuticals, whether for anything else. We made the products, the diagnostics, the therapies that we were supposed to make. And so I'll get back. So in 1983, I went to the lab, to the new program that was just starting up, and I took a job working for Frank Rossetti, who had he and Bernie had discovered HTLV1. He also discovered interleukin-2, that was called T cell growth factor or Frankie's factor when he was part of the team, a major part of the team that discovered that in Bob Gallo's lab. So you see, the reason why T cell growth factor is important is because if you can't grow the T cells, you can't isolate a virus that causes adult T cell leukemia. So the retrovirus, they isolated retrovirus. And so, you know, Dr. Rossetti, when he first went to Bob Gallo's lab, was told, don't bother looking for human retroviruses, they don't exist. And Frank thought humans are just like any other animals, and he, of course,
let's just drive off of this tributary for a quick sec here.
Okay.
So we are seeing the clinical presentations of this Wuhan virus, or SARS-CoV-2, all right, that where it's non-ARDS and it's affecting red blood cells and T cells.
Correct.
Right. So what's your take on that? Do you see this as an acute disease or something that has a very high potential for a chronic disease?
Well, I see this as not due to a coronavirus. So this is where it's real. That's why I was going off in that point, and we'll keep flashing back. So that's the way I wrote both books. We wrote both books, Kent Heckenlively and I, as flashbacks, where literally I'm flashing back to the day I'm locked into jail, or a couple weeks before that, where I'm hunted down like an animal before they finally caught me and threw me and held me in jail without charges. And so we'll go to that, and it'll get there. But so what COVID-19 means either coronavirus infectious disease or coronavirus disease 19. I've heard different things. The CO means corona, the VI means virus. That's not the way you usually call a virus. You say infectious disease. COV means coronavirus. So SARS-CoV-2 is the infectious agent that we're talking about, that causes upper respiratory infection. It's named SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome virus number 2, because it's CoV-2, because it's coronavirus, and its strain it's most closely related to is the original SARS virus that had the outbreak of the disease.
Well, I don't know if you know my background, but I mean,
no,
I became, and all right, so I became, I've became kind of, I've had a notoriety since January 24th or 25th. Okay. So I attack this through bioinformatics. And
Correct.
when I looked at the genome,
Correct.
all right, I saw that at the replicase end of the genome for what they had at that time was called Wuhan pneumonia syndrome or something, virus or whatever they called it.
Right.
Before they renamed it,
Right.
the SARS-CoV-2.
Correct.
And when I looked at from a bioinformatic perspective, I could tell that it was bioengineered. All right. And
well, I think of it differently, but we'll say
well, all right, okay, but all right, so but just really quick, because my channel knows all right, so that SARS-like virus was mixed with SARS coronavirus to make, and that was built as a substrate to develop this SARS-CoV-2. And then there was a pseudovirus that led to gain of function with the HIV homology. This was developed in 2008. I have the paper on my website. All right, so I have the paper on my website. So I from a bioinformatics side could prove that it was bioengineered. Now, at that time, when I looked at it, I assumed that it was going to be bioengineered for scientific purposes to develop therapeutics or vaccines.
Correct.
Now, so they did gain of function from the bat ACE2 receptor to the human ACE2 receptor, and they needed that HIV homology. Now, eventually, what happens is that it bifurcates and starts into a weapons program. And I believe that what happened was at Fort Detrick with the University of North Carolina, with Dr. Shi and others, that there was an additional gain of function where it was affecting multiple receptors. And those multiple receptors are CD147, CD209, CD299, and GRP78. Now, with those, especially the CD147, I believe that's the pathway where it's infecting the red blood cells, giving the non-ARDS. And I believe that the CD147 pathway is infecting the T cells. Now, my concern is that when we go into memory, the T cell memories, and it goes to G0, are we going to have some sort of dormancy here? But I attacked it from the bioinformatics side and the paper trail with the research that was published.
Correct.
I could find it all going all the way back to 2008. Some people say maybe a little bit earlier than that, but it doesn't matter. But the point is that okay. But the point is they did it.
Correct.
Right? And then we know that the program was shut off at Detrick, and then it was shipped over to different labs, especially the Wuhan facility, the P4 lab, where additional gain of function happens. And it leaks out. Now, the question is, was it leaked out on purpose or on accident? I don't know if we can ever figure that out, but it leaks out.
And here's, so we don't disagree at all. We don't disagree at all. So there's a couple of key words that you said, that you're saying, and this goes to even things that happened to me and where we're going to talk about can't replicate. So we say it. A virus is never an it. And there are many strains of virus. And every time, so what was sent around the labs wasn't a highly purified stock of virus. What was sent around the labs, and this is noted in the paper, was Vero E6. That's a clone. The E means the clone of E6. And the Vero monkey kidney cells, clone E6, doesn't have type 1 interferon pathway. That's why I said that's the first thing I make. So it's a little virus factory. So what they were shipping from the labs that started in Fort Detrick clearly says Tony Fauci funded that, clearly said we originally, in the 2015 paper, with the Wuhan, North Carolina, Harvard, we originally got the cells from Fort Detrick. And here's the cell line. And so, yes, did that happen in 2003, 4, 5? I worked with that cell line, and I grew Ebola in that cell line in 1999. In 1998 and 7 is part of my job. That's why I said it was going to be so hard, and why I had to flash back to talk about my career and what I did and why it matters. So you're exactly right. And I don't use the word engineered. So parts were engineered exactly as you say. But when you grow in Vero monkey kidney cells, what can you get? Well, you get passenger viruses. So it doesn't have to be that it at all. And so to me, COVID-19 looks like retroviruses, those gamma retroviruses, and Mason, Pfizer, monkey virus, and mink cell. What's a mink? Oh, a mink's a little animal. So mink cell focus forming virus. That was one of the viruses that was a gamma retrovirus that was in our paper, in our bioinformatics tree of strains we had isolated from people. So when you say you did the sequencing of strains, every time we grow in that fermenter, those Vero E6 cells containing that virus, it picks up and mutates and recombines. And so in only 2 weeks in a fermenter, you can, and this is what we learned in 2011, you can get recombinants, and we, at the time we called them XMRVs, and we knew later, and from our original studies from data that didn't make sense in our published paper that now make perfect sense. And that's why it matters to what they did to me and say they couldn't replicate. Because of course, you're looking at a bioinformatics strain. So you're only allowed to see what they give you. And that's why I said you only get what you see under the light post. And so in 2011, when our research was shut down on the XMRVs, well, XMRVs could be xenotropic monkey gamma retroviruses as well. And that's Mason Pfizer. That's mink cell focus forming virus. And you see my colleagues had all of the reagents for, I mean, 1,000 different antibodies to detect different family members of the viruses and isolate them, and that's and identify them. And so different antibodies, as you know, recognize different things. Some are neutralizing, some are not. So at any rate, so these were the tools that we use. And so you're exactly right in what you say, because you were only given a few strains. And so you could only detect what's there. And when your PCR or when your enzyme test only identifies. But when you have biological reagents, which is why I said I had my degree in biological chemistry with a specialization, chemistry with a specialization in biology. 128 of my 132 hours at University of Virginia were science or math. And the only 6 hours was one fabulous English lit course that I took for fun, and German, because it was required to know German to have a chemistry degree at University of Virginia. So this is, you know, how you think about. So you're exactly right, but I don't use the term engineered. I use accelerated evolution because every time you grow that fermenter, that vat, in 2 weeks in a cell line, the E6 clone that has no type 1 interferon. So it's a virus machine. You cannot shut it down the way we would shut it down. And so the way our bodies would stop that infection.
So I have a quick question about the RETG13 line.
Okay.
So I don't know. So is this, see, I came from the thought that
RETG13 line. Tell me what RETG means.
RATG13 line was one of the line. What are the line? Well, it was released from China, so who knows? All right. And they're basically saying that that was one of the early potential zoonotic lines.
Correct.
Now, what I thought was that there are multiple scientific lines that you're talking about here that have been developed, and there are probably multiple bioweapon lines that have been developed. All right. Now
I think they're the same thing.
Okay. All right. Well, that's even better. It makes it easier.
Call them the same thing.
Yeah. Well, see, what I was thinking is there was a scientific line, and then they spun it off and then gained more function, where it had the ability for multiple receptor.
Correct. And that
affinity.
is absolutely a possibility. Absolutely. So you can't rule that out given the information we're given. And so, yeah.
There's something weird about the RETG13 line.
Right. I
because
never it.
because you know, yeah, you know, all right, so you know, but it was released from China, and they were saying that was potentially one of the zoonotic substrates that everything was built off of. You know, if it was either grown in the lab, or if it was restrictive enzymed, or if it was CRISPR'd, you know, whatever. It doesn't really matter. I mean, it just, it was made. So so how so my understanding is that Fauci and the organization that he works for and his whole department,
the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, correct?
Right, they funded this development.
Correct. And so that makes him culpable. You know, he knew it was against the law in this country at some point, and he just continued the work and funded it in China, in Wuhan, China. And you follow that paper trail from the papers. The scientific papers have to say who funded it. So one of the people who funded, or one of the NIAID grants, was awarded to the Barrick Lab in North Carolina. And at least one of the grants was awarded to Ian Lipkin at Columbia. And that grant was a $34 million grant that he was awarded literally right after publishing the fraudulent multi-center study in MBio, which, you know, it ended the discussion about XMRVs forever, ended the discussion about the XMRVs forever. $34 million, Center for Discovery. Oh, how nice. Commission fraud, which is why I said that about Science, the journal, and about that paper, and I can explain exactly what happened.
Well, what I noticed about the SARS-CoV-2 crisis is that nature seems to be trying to do a cover-up. They're either retracting papers, or they're promoting papers that are like saying, this is zoonotic, don't worry about it. This was just from nature, you know, and all this. And my take on this is that they're trying to cover up the weapons program in China and cover up the weapons program in the United States. And I'm to the point that the people that were involved in this, the high ups, they need to be investigated, and if found guilty, should be charged for crimes against humanity. Because we have over 300,000 individuals that have died from SARS-CoV-2. All right, there's more than 84,000 Americans that have died from it.
And I still, the only point I didn't finish is I believe it's not SARS-CoV-2, it's not a strain of virus, and I believe there are XMRVs involved. And the pathogenesis, the cytokine signature, the microvasculature, everything. So there's a paper I use, and I'll bring it up on the screen. And it's called The War Between the Microbes, and you'll appreciate this. And it was published in, it's okay if you shut the door, sweetie pie. So let me share my screen. And it was published in 2009, but we've always had these ideas about it. And what it says is viruses rarely, if ever, travel alone. And this is why we keep going into the conversation of that HIV doesn't cause AIDS. So you see how we could say, oh, and SARS-CoV-2 is called that strain of virus, that virus, you're only allowed to have this span of sequences, causes COVID-19. But the clinical data don't support that, and viruses rarely travel alone. So let me show you the shared screen here.
So we're dealing with a cornucopia of viruses here.
Exactly. So we're dealing with a cornucopia, and they don't want you to know that. So hang on, David. All right, hang on. I got to answer the door. My husband just walked away.
Yeah, no problem. No problem.
Doorbell ringing. So, hi.
You must be Judy.
I am.
So FedEx didn't understand where 107 was.
Correct.
They left me a box at my room. I was going to bring it over for you, but you weren't here.
Oh, sure, that's wonderful. I need that. Thanks. Sorry, we got something delivered. So can you see the title of this paper? Can you see this?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, so it's 2009, and it's War and Peace Between the Microbes. And so this is why we say to this day HIV doesn't cause AIDS, and why I say to this day that that my PhD thesis changed the paradigm for treating HIV/AIDS. And some of the figures in this paper is exactly why. And this is what we're talking about. It's not really a cornucopia, but several interacting viruses. Let me see if I can get it to change the page. Several interacting viruses, and here's what you see. And this is what we know the history is, not just viruses, but pathogens. So here, this is figure 1 in this paper is right here, and I've used this in several of my HIV, my XMRV talks to support what the data were saying about the XMRV association with a number of diseases. So here's the host virus equilibrium is disrupted by HIV. So you have symbiotic viruses, microbiome, virome, endogenous, and your immune system. Thanks, sir. And what's your name, sir?
My name's John.
Hi, John. Nice to meet you. I know you live
I'm in the leasing office.
right in the leasing office.
Yeah,
Okay.
I couldn't find you either. I went chronologically.
Okay.
And is it Terry on the other end?
Yeah,
Terry said, no, 107 is way over here. I went, well, that doesn't make sense.
I know. Thanks, John. Okay, sorry, I was waiting for that package and we're in development. Okay, so so you get triggering the immune response. So anything that triggers the immune response, the symbiotic viruses are contained in their replication by type 1 interferons, by RNases, by all of those things. And then when immunocompetence is your balance. This is a teeter-totter. So then you get a virus that comes in the green, and that becomes the straw that breaks the camel's back to an immune system that's overwhelmed by things. And so if you consider this SARS-CoV-2, then it wakes up the either dormant or latent viruses, which is why I've been discussing no masks, because you suppress, and in the case of the immune suppression, Dr. Blaylock did a nice paper where he showed that CD4 T cells, that memory immune response gets disrupted. So here's your HIV, and you get that cytokine storm, and it's straw that breaks the camel's back, and you get things like HHV6, and I'm talking about HIV. You talk in HIV, this paper is about HIV, but you can apply it to XMRV, you can apply it to SARS-CoV-2, and this is what I'm saying, because these mouse and animal tissue viruses, so here's all the mechanisms. So here's all the viruses on table 1. So you have immune activation. So you need to wake up these things. So that wakes up hepatitis C, HSV2, the herpes virus, CMV, EBV, HTLV2, HTLV1, anything else that was in those animal tissues. And then you've got the transactivation and the JC virus, which in the brain can kill you right away. So that's why you don't give certain drugs, because they can wake up JC virus and you're dead. So,
and this is why there is a lot of evidence that if you have the right nutraceutical, if you have the low inflammation, if you're quieting this stuff down to prevent the flare up.
Correct.
See what happens is we know that the Chinese we know that the Chinese started procuring an amazing amount of vitamin C right when they were starting to have the military. Their military was procuring. So, but the point here is that if you can boost your immune system and quiet that cytokine storm, so you're not awakening the immune system response.
Happening. The immune competence right here, that teeter-totter cannot teeter at all.
Right.
Boost your immune system with type 1 interferons, which are RNA viruses. And there's a spray that, we get a type 1 interferon from bovine, from cows. And we use that. We spray that in our mouth. We've done it for some time now, and to protect compromised people. So there's your teeter-totter. So when you break the system down, with the SARS-CoV-2, then you've disrupted the whole system. But what's also important here is look at the bottom of this table says, note that the co-infecting virus may interact with HIV-1 through multiple mechanisms. In contrast to other viruses like HTLV2, HHV6, again, which was thought to be a causative agent for chronic fatigue syndrome. And of course, back in HIV days, CMV was strongly associated with, it caused cancers and things because it inhibited apoptosis of infected cells, and EBV. So when you look at the family members of viruses, it says some of those viruses, GBVC and MV virus, actually suppress HIV infection. And so this is where you talk about the flu vaccine and its use. And this is why what you're saying is true and what I'm saying is true, and how the government absolutely knows, because in that paper of the flu vaccines, we know that it's called viral interference. Sometimes influenza viruses and waking up that part of the immune system with the flu vaccine can suppress the infection of other respiratory infections or suppress the expression of other respiratory viruses. But that's not so with coronavirus. And there's only one paper, but there's all with flu vaccines, but it's also DTP shots. We've known this throughout history, that vaccines can exacerbate or amplify your susceptibility to a coronavirus. Because so the immune competence, so and that we're being told to wear masks and suppress your CD4, your memory responses, and clearly the most oxygen depleted are the people who already have the viruses and the diseases. And that's why I keep saying the XMRVs are part of this. And that's why Ian Lipkin got awarded the $34 million grant. So what does he do right after he puts to bed XMRVs, Judy Mikovitz and Frank Rossetti forever, forces them out of all work? Literally, it's as if Good Morning America had XMRV, all a hoax going across the bottom of the screen. So you can see how the fake news is married to the fake science news. And this is where, President Trump is correct. So the horror for everything happened to me is Nature, the journal, Science, the journal, are little more than fake news and commercials for a government agenda, which literally, that's why I call this a plague of corruption. That's why we wrote the book, and the book looks like prophecy. And because I didn't realize any of this when we wrote our first book, Plague, which detailed this kind of scientific misconduct and fraud at every level. And that's why my response when the science hatchet job writer, commission writer, Martin Enserink and John Cohen are the two that went after me for 3 years and just kept showing you the fraud. And that's in my Truth About Cancer talk. And I really didn't even know it until 2019. So these are data. And what happens with the writers and the editors of these journals who are not scientists is they tell America what you should be interpreting. So from the beginning, we said XMRV caused chronic fatigue syndrome. One sequence, VP62, the only sequence we were allowed after the fact to call XMRV, after the fact. because that was the infectious molecular clone. That wasn't the natural isolate that Bob Silverman, that's why we call it the assassin clone in our book, because it assassinated us, because the government said you can only say SARS-CoV-2. So they're saying, oh, it's not engineered, because you're not allowed to see the millions of sequences around the world. And so it really is important to see that as these viruses talk to each other, we can see the exact cytokine signature. So the SARS-CoV-2 signature, I mean, it's exactly the one we published in 2011 for XMRVs. So just because nobody will identify the XMRVs, what is the government test? The only
Well, wait, I get a question. So
Yeah.
you know the actual serum concentrational levels of these interleukins? I mean,
yeah.
I have access to MDs that I can what is the signature?
I'll get that
If
right.
you could send me, you know, somewhere the actual signature.
Yeah, I'll send you the paper
of the different cytokines, and then I want to dive into that.
Here's the signature paper, and we actually published this after, you know, in early 2011. But this is my intellectual property. I did that first at the lab of Lab of Antiviral Drug Mechanisms, and I say our team when I say as I directed this, the first thing we started doing was these multiplex disease signatures of infection or disease. So I didn't say, I said the XMRV virus associated chronic fatigue syndrome. Everybody knows you can have chronic fatigue syndrome from a cause other than this virus. So we went after only these patients with this disease signature. And so that disease, but we did this work. See how I have HHV6, EBV, and CMV? Because I knew the LISCO paper. We did this before we isolated the virus, because that's why I told you how Frank Rossetti and Bernie Poise succeeded.
Well, I've been saying from day one that we're going to start seeing a lot of peripheral nervous system disorders.
Exactly. And now they're saying Kawasaki. Oh, yep. That's what CFS patients have. That's what chronic Lyme patients have, because the same immune pathways are dysregulated by different interactions, whether it be Borrelia and XMRV. And this is why we wrote our books based on the band played on the movie. And everybody really needs to look at the band played on by Randy Schiltz, because he wrote the book, and that's where the opportunistic infection. So here's the 6 cytokines, and we did a huge panel. So here's the panel of cytokines, up and down for IL-7, and I'll send you this paper as soon as we finish talking today.
Okay, great.
Along with the other things we're talking about. But you see how the inflammatory signature. So what have you reduced? Oh, interferon alpha. Oh, MCP1, macrophage chemotactic protein 1. So we had a signature of disease that had 97% as a diagnostic test. And again, when they destroyed my career, they destroyed evidence of this. And this paper was published in In Vivo, a rather obscure journal, because nobody would publish our papers in 2011 because, and they only published negative studies that didn't at all use the method, didn't at all use biology, and they were commissioned fraud. So, so you know that you can't publish, and here it is. So the CFS patients who are known to have a viral or flu-like onset and have tested positive for XMRV by PCR and or serology. So it can be that those antibodies I told you we had that detected conformational epitopes, not the sequence epitope that the PCR would detect. And it was the conformational epitope that allowed us to have and from our test from the beginning, our science paper of October 2008, it clearly showed multiple strains. But because Bob Silverman was, made the mistake in his lab, which he admitted to Frank Rossetti, not to me, but to Frank Rossetti in June, when we were in a meeting in Belgium, June, I'd say it was about the 6th or the 4th through the 6th in Leuven, Belgium. And he said, oh, Joy is the name of J.Dip.Gupta, and you can go to our original science paper. I'll show it to you. Joy feels really bad about what happened. Well, what happened? Well, he attempted to sequence the samples we sent to him from the viruses we isolated from the patient's blood, from their serum, from their plasma, and he attempted to sequence them as XMRV, the infectious molecular clone. And they never were that. And so by the time we sent him like 3 samples and he was amplifying these with PCR, Dr. Rossetti and I both said, absolutely not, no more samples, because you're risking contamination. Because when HTLV1 was isolated, there was no such thing as PCR. So you don't have the risk. So when you risk a natural isolate with an infectious molecular clone, the clone outgrows the natural isolate by millions of times. And this is how those later studies became fraud. So you see, the Low and Alter identified XMRVs, and the government said, no, they didn't confirm their work, and they actually did, because we never said it was that sequence, VP62. But see, they pigeon, and our paper didn't say it either, and we didn't say cause. And here's the clear title of what we really said. So
exactly.
This is where these commercials, the John Cohens, the Martin Enserings, so it's propaganda masquerading as science. So scientists are good people doing their work, and the people that blow up this study and the opinion paper in Science, the journal that was originally published online October 8th of 2009, the opinion paper was by John Coffin. And John Coffin's that same man that in 1975 said to Frank Rossetti, don't bother looking for human retroviruses because they don't exist, disease-causing retroviruses. So again, here he published this paper, and the editorial that said, one new virus, how many old diseases? And by the last professional debate with John Coffin, which I'll show you and share the screen in another way here in a second. The last professional debate I had with John Coffin was how many new viruses have we created, John, by injecting proviruses? You know what a retrovirus is? All you need is the DNA, the blueprint. It inserts himself into your white blood cells or into any replicating cells. Think about the explosion of colon cancer. XMRVs, anyone? Absolutely. And here's I'll go ahead and rip through this kind of quickly. But this matters because of the contaminated blood supply. I first reported that the blood supply of London was contaminated when I appeared when all of us had an international workshop on XMRVs. And I say international because a lot of positive data came. People came from everywhere and submitted their abstracts. Children, autism, ITP, blood diseases, chronic lymphocytic leukemia. Oh, here's this. And things like we're talking about right now. Oh, wait a minute, they're causing microvascular disorders. Oh, wait a minute, they're causing, people are more susceptible if they have hemochromatosis. Why? Because ferritin in the blood and dysregulation of hemoglobin creates a cytokine storm that's very similar, overlapping to the signature I just showed you for XMRV. So right after that meeting, Francis Collins, I gave the talk on the chronic fatigue syndrome, and I used a patient cohort from London, from the UK, around London, where we sent a phlebotomists. Blood Phlebotomy Services International still exists under the direction of Ed Cutler, and you can call him. He's still a colleague and a friend. He knows exactly what we do. These samples didn't get contaminated in the lab, so it's the exact opposite. This natural evolution, and these people that are walking around spreading these viruses for decades are getting infected. So I showed the London cohort. I used 2 different kinds of tests, and I can give you, I'll email you, I'll find that slideshow that I gave on September 6th or 7th of 2010 at this international workshop. In our first book, we have the entire abstract book. I'll make sure you get that. You see, every one of our books is heavily referenced with the proof of the science they don't want you to know. So it says here, and this is a former CDC employee. This is Suzanne Vernon, PhD.
I only see the top of your screen.
Okay, so
if you're trying to show something.
Do you see agency heads are scared?
No, it's just, I just see the top the top toolbar that you have on your screen.
Okay, let's see if I can okay, so let's I'll do a new share. Let's do this one, and then I'll
I can see the plague of corruption. Yeah.
Okay, now this
so everybody buy her book. Everybody buy her book.
Well, books, they matter, these books, and this one's harder to read. Plague is a lot harder to read because it's just science, and I had no idea. You know, and so Kentucky Lively is a 6th grade science teacher and an attorney, and a father whose daughter was clearly injured and infected with XMRVs, severely vaccine injured. That's what I wanted, sweetie pie, so I'm not waiting for anything else. Okay, so my husband. So this is what my comment that I made in a newspaper in 2014 when this book was published here, said retroviruses and environmental toxins led to this explosion of chronic diseases. And then plague of corruption, of course, is I realized after this book was in press in 2014, August 31st of 2014, is the first time I really understood this had anything to do with vaccines, anything to do with the cover-up of MMR, Andy Wakefield, Brian Hooker, William Thompson, because on August 31st, 2011 and 14, you know, 3 years after I was jailed, and this was one of the first times I was allowed to go out, but I wasn't allowed to speak in public because under threat of being arrested again. So again, there's no gag order other than the fact they've already done this to me. And I was, you know, my lawyers said, oh, they had no evidence the first time, did they? And so they, you know, if I publicly went on Facebook, if I did blogs, if I talked to you, if I did anything in this window where they dropped the criminal charges of fugitive from justice, felony fugitive from justice without a parking ticket. How can you be running when you're at home after you've been fired? 6 weeks after you've been fired, your charge, and this charge was put at NIH by Tony Fauci in you know, after you know, before I was arrested, and to keep me from participating physically in a lab in the multi-center study that was published in 2012, September, October. I'm held under these criminal charges until June 12th. And when they're dropped on June 12th, they're dropped without prejudice, meaning at any time they can come right in my house and they took all between the day I'm fired, September 29th, and the day that I'm arrested, false arrest, held in jail on this felony charge. And we'll get into that. You know, I'm not allowed to say one word until the end of 15, which is supposedly when I committed the crime that there's no crime. Anyway, charge. So it's really hard for a scientist because on some of these interviews, and I believe in Plandemic movie, I said there's no charge. Well, how can you be a felony charge a fugitive from justice with no warrant. And this is where we go. This is the kind of power these people have. So I was on this slide before. So right after I gave the talk at the first and last XMRV workshop, you know, Suzanne Vernon, a 20-year CDC employee, says on agency heads are scared to death. And she said this 4 days after I showed, and all Francis Collins said about my study, where it was something like 60 or 70% positive in the patients and 4% in the controls, was where'd you get the controls? And I said, my collaborator, and he got them from the blood supply of London. Well, this was in 1991, at the height of HIV infection, before we changed the paradigm with my PhD thesis, which they said it didn't change any paradigm. Hey, you could say that, but hey, the data reflect differently. 1999, 1 million Americans were infected with HIV. So in 2010, this is 10 to 25 million Americans. 3.75 is the negative controls in our science paper, and Harvey Alter's confirmation found 7%. That's 40 million, 30 million Americans in 2011, which likely got into humans by a contaminated blood supply. And now it had been contaminated since the 80s. And how do we know that? Because here is Shai-Xing Lo's confirmation study, and the Science Mag article yesterday. Another one of these commission things. It's a freelance writer telling you what the public what really happened in the science, and that's not what happened at all.
And I noticed the same thing was happening when I was starting to start talking about this bioengineered.
Right. Correct.
SARS-CoV-2, you have all these writers saying, "Oh, correct. There's no way." They're trying to bury. Correct. They're trying to bury the weapons program.
Correct. And so they're burying it. So this is exactly that. You've got editorials, and they're inviting papers. Well, what do you need to make a living? Oh, publications in good journals. Oh, you get a Nature paper. Oh, you get a Science paper. Oh, they're fraud. I mean, they're commission fraud. And that's the hardest thing in all of this for me to comprehend, is that our fake news, Washington Post, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, CNN, is based on fake science news. You know, right. So our whole science for
it's been infiltrated. Years, it's been infiltrated. Yeah.
Correct. And so here's what Harvey Alter actually said. His paper's down here on the right. And he said, so it's probably better term is murine leukemia virus related viruses, which is exactly what the title of our paper was, XMRV, but we were only of an infectious retrovirus, XMRV, because that's what Joy Dasgupta, here's Jay, his name is JDIP. He's technically the second author of the paper because there's two co-first authors, meaning they contributed equally. Lombardi was doing the immunology correlates, like the signature of infection, and we couldn't find a correlate like NK cells or something that's in all of the patients because there were so many strains and there were so many things that we didn't understand. So Frank Rossetti did all the virology because he's the pro. He started the whole field. And they're co-first authors. Joy Dasgupta, he's called Joy, did the sequencing. So he's the one that came to us when we sent him samples. Our lab was never contaminated. The samples went one way. And so we sent the samples that we'd isolated from the patients who we knew to be positive to Joy. And after the third attempt, we said no more samples. And then suddenly he came up with it XMRV. And because nobody knew there was a family, they only had sequences from PCR. They made a synthetic infectious molecular clone. Their papers on this virus family was first done in 2005 in prostate cancer. How do I know that? I'm making drugs for prostate cancer and neuroimmune disease because they involve the same pathways and the same diseases for inflammatory hormone-driven cancers. This is what I do for a living. So, so we had to say an infectious retrovirus, XMRV. in the blood cells. That's where we found it with patients. Does that say cause to you? Nope. And what the last line of the science paper said, taken together, these data demonstrate the first direct isolation of an infectious XMRV from humans and implicate a role for XMRV infection in the pathogenesis, in the causation of CFS. We didn't say cause. We didn't say, we said implicate a role. And again, we could only say XMRV became only to the government and everyone else that VP62. So when Harvey Alter comes along and says, oh, the better term is XMRVs that also include this virus. And where did he get them? Well, he got them from chronic fatigue patients. Shai-Xing Lo worked in HIV/AIDS, and his theory was mycoplasma was the causative agent, a causative agent. And so when it worked out that the HIVs were more associated with the immune dysfunction and the acquired immune deficiency and the breaking of that immune competence teeter-totter, without the HIVs, you don't get AIDS. So it's HIV doesn't cause AIDS. The opportunistic infections in the total breakdown that I just showed you is AIDS. So now we know you can have HIV and never get AIDS. And that's what my PhD thesis was. Molecularly, how do you keep the virus silent so people never get AIDS? And then we developed drugs around that, and that's the history. So you can say I didn't do anything. I don't care. I never really cared what anybody said about me. This is a corrupt old boys network. If you think a woman's going to go in there and make a discovery, when people like John Coffin said, did their disease-causing retrovirus, and he was embarrassed because he wrote the article that said one new virus, how many old diseases? And at the end of the day, it was how many new viruses and how many new diseases or how many exploding diseases. And we'll show that. So this paper was published in 2010, but the PNAS journal, it was in press when the CDC got wind of it, and oh shit, they just replicated them, and it fit with our data. But what's the bigger problem here? Where'd Shai-Xing Lo get the samples? Oh, back in the 80s, he froze a box of samples, and I'm not sure exactly what the box says, but non-HIV AIDS. Why? Because they came from women and children. They had all kinds of T cell defects. They had all kinds of immune defects. They weren't gay men. It was called gay-related immune deficiency. Right. And they had clearly no evidence of LAV, HIV, or the other pathogens. And so what he did when he saw our paper is he pulled this box out of the freezer, used our method in those samples with PCR, our PCR method, and he adapted it a little bit to catch the wobble in the strains. And there you are. 86.5% in samples from 1991 to 94. So how long's the blood supply been contaminated, folks? And how much disease have we spread with how many strains of viruses? And oh my God, it was so much more than HIV and HHV6 and mycoplasma mold. It's the Borrelia. And it says, so why, and so what they tried to do, and so in 2011, Harvey Alter picked the poison to have his paper withdrawn. And this was another lie of the science paper from yesterday. It wasn't retracted. His paper was not retracted. He withdrew it. Why did he withdraw it? Because he ran out of this box of samples. We tested him so many times between 9 and 11. He had no more samples. So he couldn't repeat his study. That's why he withdrew it. And so but we were forced to retract the data. And I say force authors to destroy the data because that's why I was fired. And this is what I learned after, and I didn't know that's what was going on. That's what I'm trying to say. So this is what I learned after I met Brian Hooker in 2014, because nobody knew about William Thompson. Nobody knew about the data dump at the CDC where they brought everybody in on a weekend. Oh, why do they do it on a weekend? Oh, because the government's closed and all these people can't get charged with federal crimes. And they had a data burning party. And William Thompson, as we know from the movie Vaxxed and now from as a whistleblower, he knew it was illegal to destroy federally funded data. So he simply put it in the safe for 20 years and drank himself to death while Brian Hooker, son, who's severely injured as well, did freedom of information, FOIA, FOIA, FOIA. Show us the raw data. Use raw data. Don't use crap ass statistics. So anyway, so this is, this paper was submitted to PNAS, and I'm going to say March or April of 2010. Within months, within months of our paper, they had the data. There was also another investigator named Gary Owens who also replicated our findings, and he did that within 1 month. Oh, but they renamed that too. He called it XMRV2 in his talk. He gave this talk in Cleveland at the Cleveland Clinic where Silverman worked in a meeting they held November 10th, 2009, and he called it XMRV and the numeral 2. Because it was a family member. It was, and so John Coffin stood up there, screamed at him, said, "You can't call it XMRV2. You don't know phylogeny." So they tweaked everything into a phylogenetic argument, a twisted argument, like you heard Fauci yesterday talk about. Oh, we're going to do risk assessment. What is happening? You're not going to do a safety study? And in Gardasil studies, they called it immunological bridging. It's unethical to inject a 9-year-old girl. So we did the study in people from a different continent, I believe, or Mexico for Gardasil, and 30 and 40-year-old women. And we're going to use immunological bridging studies to say, oh, the same data works in a 9-year-old. This is how they fraudulently, destroy the understanding, and people can't possibly understand the fraud of all of this, like I have, but I learned. But actually this paper was held up. The editor of the journal, and I'll remember his name, and you can probably find it because he was the editor of the journal PNAS in 2010. Later, he got a Nobel Prize. He said, "I'll never, ever publish again," as they were pressured to hold this up in the galleys. And you as a scientist know what that means. It's past peer reviews. They've got it all ready to go. And they held it up while the CDC and a non-PhD named Switzer quickly fabricated a fraud based on doing a PCR towards doing a PCR that only detect VP62. So that's very, very important, that the PCR of the CDC, and then they said nobody had it. So that's one of the studies. Oh, you can't replicate it. No, nobody had it. Nobody had it, not in patients, not in controls, absolute commission fraud. This paper finally came out, and what the government said is the same thing they said. No, it's not the same thing. It's a different clone. It's a PMLV, and they just start using all this alphabet soup and phylogenetics, which you and I were talking about earlier with SARS-CoV-2. So, and what is really causing these things. So the who and where, here's the invitation only meeting, July 22nd, 2009. That's 4 months before our paper was published. And these are all the people who showed up, HIV, and all of them spent the rest of the summer. Who's John Schiller? Oh, he's one of these guys at WHO who tries to prevent anybody from figuring out what, and in America, trying to work together to keep America from knowing about adventitious viruses in vaccines. And I'll show you some of that.
Wait, before you switch the slide, the guy in the center on the left, who's that? The guy in the center. Yeah.
Harold Barnes. Harold Varmus. This picture is 2000. I know who everybody is in this paper because I put the who and why. So this is 2009. And I'll just say the introduction tells you exactly. They were worried enough about all the data that was coming in, saying, oh my God, it's a lot more than prostate cancer. Oh my God, it looks like animal caretakers are seroconverting. That means they got exposed. Oh, wait a minute. That means these things are contagious. And so that this is when the government tries to start covering it up. But what we did was we gave them all our samples. We gave Gary Owens our samples. We gave everybody our samples, and everybody replicated our data if they didn't look for VP62. If they looked using our protocols, our antibodies, we gave them all the reagents. So on October 8th, against everything the government tried to do, can you imagine a paper that gets submitted on May 6th? And then the day after this meeting, and we convinced them all with more data than was even in the paper because we had so much more and we only focused it in the journal. I mean, we had 3 times the paper. The journal cut it by 2/3. You can't say that, you can't say that, you can't say that. Has nothing to do with immunology, has nothing to do with the paper. This is virology. So, and I've got the original manuscript, I've got the original approved manuscript. So what people don't understand is peer reviewers review these papers, they say, okay, it's okay, and they rigorously do and then the journal makes it make news, especially Science and Nature. And then they let the opinion articles come out and tell the public and other scientists what to think. But other scientists never see the manuscript. And so later they said, oh, the reason why Science retracted the paper is because after the meeting, well, I'll go into that later. But so this is Harold Varmus. Of course, this is Hillary Clinton. And what's important at this, and this is the NIH Criminal Center. What's important about this is 2011. This is 2011, and the rest of the paper really doesn't matter because our book goes into a plague of corruption in quite detail. But here's Fauci, here's Collins, who when the blood supply of London was 4%, ordered Fauci to do the study. Fauci gave the direction of the study and the $2.3 million funds for the multi-center study, which was supposedly the axe that said there never was an XMRV. Judy Mikovitz is guilty, charged, done, finished in her career, and knows nothing. So these are the diseases. So when I said at the bottom of this slide, why, I said why? Because in 1999, it was 1 million Americans. And now you're talking in 2011, 25 million Americans, and it's been a decade. They're still in the vaccines. We're loading up with more and more and more. We haven't taken the Vero monkey kidney cells out, haven't taken, the maize and Pfizer, the mink cell focus for me. We haven't taken the mouse tissue out. We haven't taken, the polio vaccine is giving these infants XMRVs. And we can see that in the diseases they're developing and the amount. So here's all the diseases. Every single one with an asterisk is more than one published paper associating retroviruses and inflammation. And in the cardiovascular disease, it was called B4RV, which Gary Owens called XMRV2. Inflammation driving cardiovascular. What are we hearing in COVID? Oh, people are dropping dead after the flu vaccine. Why? Inflammation and all the garbage. Avian, the chicken eggs have retroviruses, bird retroviruses. The tetra vaccine that was introduced into Italy, never tested safe or anything like that. That tetra vaccine was grown in dog kidney cells. Dogs have coronaviruses. Sorry, what are we testing for when we test these tests? Are we testing for SARS-CoV-2? Or are we testing for the coronaviruses you wake up? Are you testing for the coronaviruses you wake up and calling people positive who've never been exposed? And did you drive with these flu vaccine programs increase the probability that people who did get exposed would get infected and get disease. So I used the title of this slide, and then I presented this talk in its entirety at Truth About Cancer on October 13th of 2019. And I showed the pictures, and I named names, and this is when our book was literally in press. The only thing that wasn't done in Plague of Corruption was Bobby Kennedy's foreword, because he didn't understand it. When I finally explained to him the depth and the breadth, I mean, I don't say I finally explained, when he saw it, and all I had to say is, think about William Thompson. And he's like, and I said, and he quoted William Thompson in that fraud. And I said, time to stop quoting the criminals and quote the heroes. Suzanne Humphreys, Brian Hooker, Andy Wakefield, Luke Montagnier, on and on and on. But Jeff Bradstreet, people who have contributed to understanding how, and this was a publication from 2011, written by a former colleague in HIV/AIDS research, and it's in the book, so I won't say it out loud. But he said, hey, when our paper was going on, and it's January of 11, and that's significant because the study design for the replication study, the multi-center study that eventually was published fraud that Science, the journal, discussed and showed the press conference for, and we can talk about that part of it. But that the study design and the funding was set November 4th, 2010. So September 6th was the meeting. Collins said, fund the study, I was going to say, fund the study, Fauci, and I was going to say limp dick, but that's what we call it.
It's okay. It's all right.
So at any rate,
He's a limp dick.
That's what we called him in the lab. Yeah.
Right.
What kind of balls does a man have who takes out
Exactly.
women and children in this woman's science?
Exactly.
None.
Exactly.
And so he wrote this opinion paper in the journal, Frontiers in Molecular Biology, January of 2011. I have no idea. I have nothing to do with vaccines. Ken Heckenlively found this paper. I have no idea. So November 4th, 2010, it's do the study. In January, it's like, oops, it's not just a contaminated blood supply, folks. It's in the vaccines. Oh, shit. And who are the most vulnerable from Thompson's work? Oh, the black boys. Oh, why? Because they don't have RNA cell. They make less RNA cells. So until you get to 3 years old with MMR, Andy Wakefield was right. He showed nonspecific inflammation of the gut. He showed the development of that fire that went on. And now we know. We were looking for biomarkers in 1999 as part of my lab of antiviral drug mechanisms for why Black people get more aggressive prostate cancers and aggressive breast cancers. So, of course, I'm making drugs for prostate cancer aggressive. We've got the XMRV associated. That was the sequences, never isolated, from Bob Silverman's work. It was people who didn't have RNA cell. So if they hadn't covered that up in 2001, what we would have known. Oh, you simply wait or protect them, or don't give them 3 RNA viruses at the same time that require. RNA cell is an enzyme that just degrades RNA floating around the blood. Can't do that. Can't have RNA floating around the blood. It's a danger signal. And that's why these vaccines they're talking about are going to kill these people. Why are the Blacks more vulnerable? Retroviruses don't know who they're infecting. These people are the ones who can't degrade. So we're seeing that in COVID-19. So everything I'm saying, I know you'll appreciate, is the plague of corruption. And that's
it's interesting that some of the studies are showing that I live in New York City, so the Bronx is starting to have a flare up, and it's the Black community that has the more severe cases.
Correct. And because I'm saying it's not just SARS-CoV-2, they've already got this. They were the most severely injured by the vaccines. They've been loaded up with most. Why? Because they can't afford to homeschool their kids. You know, the Black community in DC is an issue too. And I know that because my sister teaches kids. That sister who was the Pentagon secretary in her 20s, but retired after she got married and you know, or quit and left and became a mom. Well, she teaches inner city kids in the Black. They can't homeschool their kids. Oh, and by the way, if they get 10% off their groceries and a free shot, you know, they're in line. So these are the ones that are the most vulnerable. So we're literally killing on purpose the most vulnerable in our society and the ones we've already injured. I won't read this email, but when we found the blood supply heavily contaminated, I wrote it August 31st, 2011, when they were trying to rush this paper into the journal Science, and it wasn't going to be the blood supply is not heavily contaminated. They were going to say it was going to have nothing to do with what it should have said is the blood supply is heavily contaminated. And because there are so many strains and because they're heavily methylated and silenced, we don't have a PCR test. So we can't possibly figure out how heavily contaminated the blood supply. There were 22 CPG sites. CPG, that's methylation. That was my epigenetic revelation of how HIV, my postdoctoral studies with Stephen B. Balin, a paradigm shifting paper, again, took 5 years to get it published in Molecular Cell Bio because everybody said, that's impossible, you're an idiot. Yeah, I don't care how many times they call me idiots. It had to do with NF-kappa B too. How did we know NF-kappa B, I-kappa B, phosphorylated, held in the cytoplasm? Oh, our work with biology showed that AIDS patients have that NF-kappa B, that flame in the nucleus of themselves, turning on that cytokine signature. So when I submitted that paper, they said, you know, and what I did to do it was I isolated the nuclei away from the cytoplasm. And they said, oh, your nuclei are contaminated because everybody knows that NF-kappa B is a cytoplasmic protein. Good try, stupid. And then I just threw that in the desk drawer and said, I don't care what you think. And I was lucky all these years that I worked for Frank Rossetti because we were in the intramural program and we didn't have to publish or perish. So we were in that protected space and nobody cared about Frank Rossetti. I was the only person anybody would let him hire for 10 years. You know, when Fauci was screaming at the phone, he'd already been exiled and fired. And that's why he was bullying into giving him paper. And I actually found out the truth of that paper when I talked to Frank a week or
you know
so.
what is really amazing to me is that with Fauci, at least front stage, he seems mild-mannered and really kind. But I can tell that
he screamed at me like I'm a stupid woman, you know, you give that to, you know. And unfortunately, I was younger then, so my gut reaction wasn't fuck you. In later years, my gut reaction was fuck you, and that got me into a lot of trouble. I was fired for insolence and insubordination. And the insolence it was when told by the Whittemores of the Whittemore-Peterson Institute, my bosses, when told to cover up their misappropriation of federal fund, their unvalidated blood tests that they were selling to people and charging Medicare. When I was told to just look the other way and ignore that, I said fuck you and was fired on the street in September 29th of 2011. So yes, I was a bit rude. I should have just said no thank you, my lord. I've since studied the book of Daniel and the book Thriving in Babylon, so I'm good at that now. But at any rate, I wrote this in the late summer when it was clear that the blood supply was heavily contaminated. It was clear we didn't have a test because we didn't appreciate the heavily methylated latent sequences that you had to wake up in order to see the virus, because you'd be, now you see it, now you don't. So you take the same patients and they'd say, ha, 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 they don't have it. And you said that patient had it. We'll use 5-azacitidine, jerk. You know, but the Science, the journal, wouldn't let us. They took that out of the paper. And this was one of the other things they said, you made up that figure. No, we didn't. There was nothing fraudulent about it. We just cut it up for the purpose of one talk, September 22nd, because all the other lanes didn't matter. All that really mattered is we use 5-azacitidine. And then they said, well, you didn't say you use 5-azacitidine in the methods. You cut it out when you took 2/3 of the paper out, and you said that didn't matter. So this is how, you know, we didn't do anything. And in fact, after I was jailed and arrested and my career destroyed, they investigated every single notebook, because Frank Rossetti and Judy Mikovitz, when you work on as co-principal investigators, you have to keep all the copies of all the data. And so they investigated every single figure, where that figure originated, and said, there's no wrongdoing. Just because you didn't put 5-azacitidine in the methods, there's no wrongdoing. But they were rushing this to publish to destroy the CFS community, shut this down forever. The patient community, remember Suzanne Burton, agency heads are scared to death if XMRV works out. What do you mean works out? You know, oh, because you got 40 million Americans, and now in COVID-19, if those 40 million Americans get a flu vaccine, or get this new vaccine we have to have, they will be killed. And you will bury them as COVID-19, and you will never go find the retroviruses, will you? And it'll stay buried forever. And that's why the ferocity of the fake news response against me, because this is all out here. Well, what's interesting about this is this talk was given October 13th of 2019. And this was all in the book at the time. So, but I gave this talk because that's what Truth About Cancer asked me for. It wasn't my choice. And the book was supposed to be published on November 5th. And when did COVID-19 start? When did this rush? We better do something quick, folks. Here comes the we gotcha. And people are going to wake up. So the blood supply was heavily contaminated. And I gave this talk at the New York Academy of Sciences, right behind Ian Lipkin, the senior investigator on the multi-center study that put Judy Mikovitz away, and stood there in that press conference and said, Dr. Mikovitz, do you have something to say? And I said, it. What is it? VP62, the infectious molecular clone, because that was the only virus on November 5th when the study design was fit, because they had twisted, as I said, with Harvey Alter's things. All we could look for was VP62, and all they could look for was what they found, and it never was. And then the CDC looked for nothing because all their tests were to VP62, and we all knew VP62 wasn't there. But I was told in 11, after all that happened in 11, and it was so clear how many diseases, this is March 29th, 2011. 4 to 8%. So was it reproducibly detected? Yeah, in the population. Forget the patients, 8% of the population is still 40 to 50 million Americans that you have liability. Look what HIV cost us for 1 million American. Look at vaccine cord, already paid out billions of dollars for. This is trillions of dollars worldwide. London and the Nature Journal, they got together because London had the problem too. Remember what mad cow disease cost them? Remember London and mad cow disease. So they knew a disease to affect the economy of nations was the forward of our first book, Plague.
That was around 2000. Was that around 1999, 2000, the mad cow? Because the reason why I say that was I lived in Germany, in Lippstadt, Germany, for an automotive project. I used to be an automotive engineer. And so I was working for a company called Hella Bear Vehicle Systems.
Right.
And Hella is a very big company in Germany, and so is Bayer. Bayer is a very big company. But they did a joint venture, and we were this joint venture company. And during this time period, I remember my colleague, he was complaining that he couldn't eat beef because of the mad cow disease that was going on during that time period. So
and they're playing that same game with coronaviruses right now, aren't they?
Mhm.
Well, coronaviruses wouldn't jump species if you can use alpha interferon, but the FDA stopped that too, didn't they? So in 1980, 40 years ago, and we know the doctor who did all of that work, and we've got proof, and that will be another book that Kent Heckenlively is going to write, of this plague of corruption now for 40 or 50 years in our blood supply. But again, this talk was given March 29th. This was the conclusions right off the slide. I presented this right after Ian Lipkin. It was clear how heavily in every single study. So yeah, that's replication, folks. The only thing we don't have is the patients. Why? Because they never looked at the patients with the disease signature we did. They just pulled tired people out of the phone book. And that's the way the multi-center study was done, except for one thing. But see, this is what I said. The data suggests there are different strains of gamma retroviruses that can infect humans, just like Harvey Alter and Shai Shinglo. Assays that capture the variation of these viruses are the best. Serology and transmission, which we have the only valid in my institute, not in the company Annette Whittemore owned. They were doing the PCR that was Silverman's and never detected VP62. VP62 was never in humans. It was the XMRVs, and this is where they get to the doublespeak. So, but what did I show? Frank Rossetti taught me never show a problem without a solution. So at the end of this talk, I said, and I showed the data for this. I showed Ebola. I showed HTLV1. I showed HIV. I showed XMRVs, that this technology would clean up the blood supply. And so we could activate it. So you can almost see in retrospect the wheels turning. Uh-oh, we got a real big problem here, but we can clean up the blood supply and say this moron is just stupid and it never was contaminated. But you can't make this talk go away. And this was a detailed talk, at least 30 minutes, and I have every slide. And what did I say? Need for more full-length sequencing. Just like you're doing here, and you only get a snapshot. Your work's not wrong. Your data suggests those sequences were engineered, but so much more, because how many sequences? What we learned in this work was every time you grow that vat, every time you take those mice and you put them in different cell lines, let's just say this is Vero E6 here in this vat. Every time you do that, in 2 weeks, you can get new recombinants. You activate, you're putting different animals in different, that's why they're red and blue. So here we digest, this was from Basomatic. Remember Saturday Night Live? So I explained this to Ernie Hancock on Freedom's Phoenix for about 5 years, trying to talk retroviruses, and it's too complicated. Here it is. You digest the little mice, you take their blood, the viruses are in their blood, you grow them in the Vero monkey kidney cells, and then you take them and you don't even filter them, you don't clean them up, and you inject the whole gamish into a vulnerable baby who can't degrade them. And this is exactly what is going to happen. Probably the recombinant ones are even worse because they make them in liposomes, so they infect every cell of the body. Oh, good. Put the blueprint of an RNA virus in every cell of the body and see what kind of nightmare, how many people you kill. But basically this email says they were going to rush it to publish in August, that the blood working group, we clearly didn't have a test. I said it 2 months earlier, clearly didn't have a test that would reproducibly produce it. No question about that. And 8% of the population's a big problem for them, and they haven't cleaned it up yet. They got approved, 3 years after I went away. And I guarantee you they'll clean all the coronaviruses out of there and say that the blood supply was never contaminated, but likely because they were working on it and released it between, you can say the same thing is going on. So here is the paper that they rushed to press. That email basically said, if you rush this to press without a fair and balanced discussion, if you use the title that says failure to confirm, this was an association study. There were only 8 or 10 people in the whole study. This wasn't a failure to confirm in the blood of patients. This was the blood supply is heavily contaminated and we don't have a test. And so they called me up right after I wrote this email, Michael Bush and Simone Glenn, the head of the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. See who it's addressed to? Simone Glenn. And I copied Frank Rossetti, always do. And I blind copy him most of the time so they can't figure it out. And I said, I have IRB. They wanted to rush it to print. I said, I have IRB protected data that I can't even access. This was Labor Day weekend. And I said, given the complexities and limitations of the studies, many of which were not recognized at the time of the flawed experimental design. Once you set the experimental design, you can't change it. That becomes fraud. And that's important in every one of these studies. And I said, a holiday at that, that's unacceptable. It's not good science or a proper, appropriate process. I said, what's the rush? Afraid of the truth? Just because of how many of these viruses were introduced into the human population and are now threatening a lot more than the blood supply because a few declared it impossible 40 years ago, and John Coffin himself was the most vociferous. And then you go look at the page, and I basically said, hey, you rush it to print without a fair balance, we won't co-author it, we'll write a dissenting opinion like a Supreme Court, we won't co-author it. Frank Rossetti and my workers said, no, this is fraud. We know what we saw in that blood supply. We know what the test said and the data. And I said, if it's rushed to print without a fair and balanced discussion of its limitations, I'll spend every minute of my life exposing the fraud that it's been perpetrated against this patient population. And I mean CFS, and I mean autism, and I mean cancer. And so that's, so they obviously rushed it to press. They told on the phone the Tuesday after Labor Day, I got a call early in the morning from Michael Bush and Simone Glenn. And Michael Bush was I'm institute, I'm private. You can't threaten me in the government. But Simone Glenn is National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. And she says, Judy, and she's this French lady, Judy, I have Harold Varmus on the phone, and we're going to bring him in. And if you don't get Frank Rossetti to co-author this paper, then he's going to be fired, and he's going to lose his entire 40-year retirement, and his wife will lose it too, because they published that fraudulent science paper in 2008. So I'm saying, sorry, Frank Rossetti taught me every word of the paper is true, or you don't publish the paper. So you either change the title back, it's not a confirmation study, you don't have that powered for there's only 8 people in it. How can you call that in the blood? That had, wait a minute, a multi-laboratory study? Wait a minute, you got all the samples from me. So 3 or 4 people did their PCR, and they didn't decide there wasn't a test, which was the data, which was what should have been published. They decided, it's a multi-laboratory study. And Michael Bush, here's the senior investigator, the blood system research investigation. I guarantee you he got a lot of money from the NHLBI and from Cirrus Technologies after he published his paper. And see, they made us put our names on it because we were doing the testing. And so they told me they would change the testing. And so I was told at this September 22nd meeting, it was published online and it wasn't published in print, I think, until November 11th. I'm hiding on a boat because they're hunting me down because I refused to renounce my data. And a week later, I'm jailed. That's when the paper was published. Like, I can actually see when the papers are published. But see the last line of John Cohen's little paper over here? Mikovitz said she hopes to have full sequences of her new viruses in a couple of weeks. When's that published by this corrupt journal Science? 30th of September 2011. Oh yeah, got that. And here's your news and analysis. So here's nobody telling you you're now. This is fraud. And so it was at the IACSF meeting. They said, if I gave the talk that said the viruses are still there, they never were BP62. If I gave that talk, what else did they publish that day? Oh, here you go. I'll show it to, I think it's up here. False positive, September 21st. John Cohen, false positive. You need a big old red thing through it. And what's COVID-19's problem? The CDC, everybody admits 80% of the tests are false positive. So here the Whittemore's company not the institute, not what I worked for, but what Lombardi was misappropriating federal funds and using reagents and using salary that came from my pathophysiology grants from Tony Fauci, from the NIAID, and from the DOD. I had several grants, and supposedly, ultimately, this multi-center study. So September 21st. Oh, here's your threat carried out. So I wrote that email, and I was damned if I did and damned if I didn't. They published this to let the Whittemores know you're going to prison. You've published Medicare fraud. You're going to prison. And here's Nevada newsmakers on October 5th. Oh, I'm fired, blah, blah, blah. In a termination letter dated September 30th. Wasn't September 30th. It was September 29th. They're covering up this. She wrote the letter September 29th. But how did John Cohen know I'd never see those sequences again? Oh, because I'm fired on September 29th, standing outside my lab when they know full well I'm going to Ireland for a couple of weeks to give some talks, and I won't be there at all. Lombardi's going to reproduce data that said he wasn't misappropriating funds, take my notebooks, discard them, make them his own, so cover it all up, and say, see, she's an idiot, and see, she's that angry woman that went in there and did all this. How did he know I'd never see those sequence again? How do we know exactly where they were in my desk drawer? And my lab is broken into the same night where actually it wasn't broken into, because all my students and all my associates were locked out of the lab. I was fired about 3 p.m. And then again, it's memorialized in the journal Science. You could see exactly what they did. And then, and so then they locked it all down. They opened the desk drawers. The top folder of the right desk drawer were the sequences. Frank Rossetti had brought them to me, but he had copies. He had brought them to me a couple of months earlier, and I had showed them to Harvey Whittemore saying, hey, I'm not worried about it. I'm not worried about it. We got this. We've got the test. We'll have the diagnostics. We're fine. Oh, but then they've got a little problem, because they've misappropriated federal funds. So when I'm threatened, when I tell them to go fuck themselves in that email of August 31st, Simone Glenn, no, we don't publish fraud in Mikovitz and Rossetti world. And the minute you do anything in my lab, it's been that way forever. You're fired. No more discussion. I fired Lombardi in August. And so they put him up there as the director of the institute. So they said, oh, he mistakenly sent cells to my lab. No, he did it on purpose. He told a company that made a cell line, because he had to go replicate things. You can't, if you're a company, you can't ask a company to give you a cell line that they make money on. So he had a little problem, and I knew that because we caught him in the summer, because Frank Rossetti was directing him on the plasmacytoid dendritic cell project. Frank Rossetti was directing him on the grant. We knew he wasn't doing the work, and Frank called one day and said, tell your postdoc how to fucking freeze some cells. And I'm like, oh. And I said, what's going on? And Frank said, he asked for the cell line again. Oh, did he? Well, he was fired from my lab, and he couldn't go get them out of the freezers because we changed the passwords on the computers and on the freezers. So he couldn't go falsify any more data in my world, because we caught him. And we literally caught him physically stealing reagents while we were trying to do that blood working group and using them to make money on the test. So here's your false positive. So they go to jail. You know, that's the day before. That's the threat to me. Give the talk you want to give, and Whittemore and Peter and Whittemore's will destroy you. And Whittemore's will destroy you. And of course they did. Here you go. So here's the controversial CFS researcher arrested and jailed. And who wrote this? Oh, John Cohen again. John Cohen again comes in there and And here's what he writes. Sheriffs in Ventura County, California, arrested Mikovitz yesterday on felony charges that she's a fugitive from justice. She's being held at the Todd Road Jail without bail. But Science Insider could only obtain sketchy details about the specific charges against her. The Ventura sheriff told her they had no available details about the charges and was acting on a warrant issued by Washoe County in Nevada. A spokesperson for Washoe County said it didn't issue a warrant, nor did Reno, nor did Sparks. He said it could have been one of the several federal agencies, those same federal agencies who were scared to death in September of 2010 if XMRV works out. And here in 2012, after I'm charged, arrested, they've locked down the lab, they've got every piece of data confirmed because Tony Fauci sent Kathy Laughlin, the grants administrator, the same grants administrator that paid for the multi-center study, to inspect my laboratory before I was jailed and make sure everything was there in that 6 weeks between September 29th when I went home and to Ireland and November 18th when I'm finally captured. And the Embattled Institute retains major grant to study chronic fatigue. So they have a principal investigator, they have no principal investigator. They got a postdoc Lombardi who never did an experiment on the grant and I fired, who misappropriated federal funds. They've got a diagnostic company, they're committing Medicare, and they get to do the rarest of things. Judy Mikovitz, the principal investigator on the award, but WPI filed a lawsuit against her for misappropriating property. That wasn't the charge. That was a civil lawsuit they filed on November 4th of 2011. And they bought the judge, by the way, we got all that. But at any rate, and this is why the two books. Oh, so on November 2nd, I get a letter. I knew they locked down my lab. I knew they had everything. I went back there to get the rest of my possessions out of my condominium that I still owned after I got back from Ireland. I went home. I started looking for another job. I didn't even think about it again. I'd done everything I could to secure the data. And oh well. See, if I don't secure the data when my lab is locked down, I get misappropriation of federal fund. I get this. I lose the grants. I lose my ability to work because it's as if you leak somebody's credit card. The only one who knew what the numbers meant, who were the patients, who were the numbers, where the virus, where did they live, where were the geographic, was Judy Mikovitz. Fortunately, I have a photographic memory because that's what was in those two desk drawers that they opened up that night, fired me. My student got mad, went in there to finish an experiment and couldn't get in. So he wasn't going to let Lombardi get his research because we worked too hard and Lombardi never did a fucking experiment. And he wasn't going to let him get his data and he was going to finish his experiment and we were going to prove we were right. And he was going to graduate school in a little while, in a couple of weeks, and he had to finish so he'd get papers and publication. So he goes in the building and he finds my office unlocked, the lights on, and those two desk drawers open. And he calls me and I'm driving. I'm near Auburn, California. And so which is about 2 hours from Reno. And I've already gone home. I said, oh, I've already been fired. And I'm thinking, she'll get over it. She's just pissed off because she didn't get away with her little blood test. And I gave the talk a week earlier I wasn't supposed to give. She'll get over it. She's just pissed off because she couldn't pull her little fraud. Well, I had no idea what else they were doing. So again, here she is, February 8th. They're awarded with the grants. So they make up this story for allegedly, the civil lawsuit said, allegedly misappropriating property. But when they sent me the letter that said, here, we're going to file a lawsuit if you don't give us back our property. And here's the contract you signed when you started working here that said, we own every thought you ever had before you got here and after you leave. I didn't sign that. you know, and you can see it's fraud. You could see it was a back page without a separate page, without initials, just stuck there. And the signature, which we learned March 12th of 2012 through my then lawyer, Scott Freeman, was Annette Whittemore's, and it was fraud. And I never signed my name J. Mikovitz or Judy Mikovitz. My sisters and brothers are JLM, you know, I sign JAM. I use my either J.A. Mikovitz or Judy A. Mikovitz. I don't use Judy Mikovitz because all of us are J. Mikovitzes. So here's now May 31st of 2011. Before all of this happened, new data sparked retraction requests. But we convinced Science, the journal, that the only thing that needed to be retracted was the VP62. Figure 1, what Joy did wrong, that was the only thing that was wrong in the entire paper, and all of the rest of the data have stood till this day. And yet, and here in December 22nd, 2011, oh, I just got out of jail. In a rare move, Science, without author's consent, retracts the paper. Oh yeah, that's like fair. Yeah, got it. And yeah, why did they lose confidence? Oh, because they said we manufactured or changed the data in that slide, which I just told you. It's not wrong to think with 5-azacitidine to activate a heavily methylated site. And in that talk that I gave in Ottawa, I showed that data and I showed that slide of how we knew that from the original paper. But they're the ones that told us to cut the paper by 2/3, and that reagent wasn't necessary in the methods. So Frank Rossetti's lab was totally cleared of it. We did nothing wrong. We just took a big figure and shortened it into a simple figure because it's too complex in a 30-minute talk. So here's John Cohen, September 27th, another insider lookout, how people with chronic fatigue syndrome view the death of XMRV. Again, 2 days before I'm fired, you know, 6 weeks before I'm jailed. What'd they do in that 6 weeks? Oh, they made sure they had every single thing there. And what they didn't know is that Max caught them that night, because they were going to open those 2 desk drawers, and Harvey Whittemore wrote it in an affidavit in the lawsuit that he filed before he saw my response to the threat of a lawsuit. A lawyer wrote a letter, and she wrote it fabulously. A patient lawyer wrote it fabulously. And it was clear from the letter, which I faxed to them on November 4th, 2011, within the deadline of when I had to respond to this threat of a lawsuit I received on November 2nd. So in that time, I was told, you know, I supplied this, and I can only imagine the collective, oh shit, where are the notebooks? And so they captured Max and threatened him within his life, and they had been for quite a while. And I knew that when I went back there. This is all in the books. I knew that in October they were trying to catch me and kill me as well. These are not nice people, and $50 million lying to the FBI and stealing from the mafia is a bit of a problem. I should say their employers, the CNOs. I shouldn't use words like that. Their employers were the CNOs of Northern California, and Harvey Whittemore stole $50 million from them, and they obviously, he was going to pay them back with the money he got from the diagnostic test, and they lied to the FBI about all of that. And so at any rate, here's your insider look. And I talked about antiretroviral drug, you know, and the people who tested positive, and praised me for my talk at that meeting because it revealed why they were late and why they were silent. You know, that's my PhD thesis: negative regulation of HIV in monocytes. That's latency. How do we wake it up? How do we keep it quiet and end the disease forever? So yeah.
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
In your research, did you do anything with the TAT protein at all?
Oh, back in a long time ago, yes.
Okay.
We did a lot of that work molecularly. When I was a postdoc under Dave Dursey, I did molecular virology as my extra training. Yes, we worked, we worked with the teams like Barbara Felber and Pavlakis, Dr. Pavlakis. They did most of the work at the NCI with the TAT protein, but we published with them on several papers, and I can send you my CVs. But this last bit of payoff. So when I kept my promise from that email, Science, the journal, ended my career, and every single person who made me go away, who participated in that fraud, were rewarded. Here you go. Paper co-author Robert Silverman of the Cleveland Clinic. I requested a full retraction of our findings this summer after discovering that the blood supplies were contaminated. Blood samples were contaminated. Notice he didn't say contaminated with BP62. No, they were contaminated with XMRVs. There was no BP62 in the blood. And that matters, because that's why I said what I said at that press conference a year later. That after discovering the blood samples were contaminated, they weren't contaminated with BP62. He knew exactly what he was saying. I was in favor of a retraction of the entire paper. I'm pleased to see that the journal is now granted a retraction of the entire paper. And I agree with that decision. Well, of course you did, because you committed the fraud, and he's continued to get tens of millions of dollars of grants. And from Ian Lipkin. And what's the paper he's working with? Barrick on COVID and RNA cell in coronaviruses. Get any clue that the only pathogen in COVID isn't coronavirus? Think you got a little XMRV in there, and that's the big cover up. Anyway, so here's your Lipkin study, the great debunker. So deliberately use the wrong patients and change the study aims. So I said designed to fail. The study design was, here's the qualification. You couldn't have any medical or psychiatric physical condition that might be associated with fatigue. So forget IL-6, folks. Forget our cytokine signature. Do you know what interferon alpha at bad levels does? Oh, fatigue. We know that from using it in hepatitis C. Can't have any abnormal serum characteristics. Oh, that means you can't have ferritin. You can't have these things going on with your microvasculature. The ITP that I associated with it and showed at that New York Academy talk and gave a detailed talk. Idiopathic thrombocytopenia. You know what it is. It's a platelet disorder. It's a bleeding disorder. Oh, it's associated with MMR, says it right on the package insert from Merck. Some people can get ITP. One of my lawyers here, his kid got it. So yeah, we got that. We can fix her. You couldn't have Lyme disease. Clinically, Lyme disease and chronic fatigue syndrome are indistinguishable. And so our idea at the time, and it's in play, is that when you have Borrelia and you have XMRV, that's your in the war and peace among the microbes. Pathogens rarely travel alone. They take out the natural killer cells. They take out the same thing. Can't have hepatitis B virus or C virus. Can't have HIV infection. Can't have tapeworm. What's working in COVID? Ivermectin. What's ivermectin do? Tapeworm. I'm just saying. And then a year later, so these were the study, but I got smart in the November 4th meeting. Because we were all supposed to have a say in which patients were picked, and that wasn't going to happen because they brought in their hit squads. You can't say they can't be. They're a wonderful science. I said, I didn't say they weren't wonderful doctors. They just don't have the patients we have. Dan Peterson would send fibromyalgia and the patients that didn't have the infections and the cytokine signatures, he'd send them to Lucinda Bateman. Oh, so she was the cohort in Utah. So the cohorts had nothing to do with the disease. And the only one that did, and you couldn't have Hashimoto's thyroiditis, and that was strongly associated. So Susan Levine's center in New York, she couldn't use anybody with Hashimoto's thyroiditis. So, and then they put Dan Peterson in a cohort. Well, wait a minute, he can't, and the qualification with him is that he couldn't use anything we'd ever used in our study before. Oh, take out those 2,000 people, call them up on the phone book, and everybody got paid. And they're still getting paid to this day. Dan Peterson and Maureen Hansen are getting grants based on their participation in this fraud. So you can follow the money, and it's everyone. So here's a year later, and Ian Lipkin's quote, and the only center that was left was Montoya in Stanford. And it was the last patient cohort to come in. And Frank Rossetti and Maureen Hansen started getting them positive. I'm doing virology by telephone because Fauci has put a fugitive from justice at the NIH, and I'm not even allowed to fly through NIH airspace. I don't know if he thought I was dropping virus through the air on the airplane at Dulles Airport. You know, I've lived there for 22 years, and I'm not allowed to go visit my mother for her birthday. Oh, good, and still participate in his fraud. So here's Ian Lipkin's quote. We found, so Fauci stopped the study. When Frank got it positive, he said, that's it. When we got to the last cohort, he stopped it. There should have been 400 more samples, and he stopped it. And Frank and Maureen were getting them positive, and so they convinced Maureen and Frank. Frank and I knew it wasn't contamination, but they said Fauci said, that's it. I'm stopping the study. I'm tired of wasting money. We're done. That $2.3 million. Oh, you gave $3.7 million to Wuhan, and we can't find out if something's that important to 50 million Americans. Really, you're going to stop it? Well, he stopped it because we were getting them positive, and we would have found the association. And he further lied to us, and that's another reason we spoke at that press conference. He further lied to us, and he said, all the patient characteristics were, all the patient centers were equally represented. The 1,000 samples you already got were the same number of samples from either cohort. And we didn't learn until September 10th, a year after I sat down at that, September 12th, I believe, was that press conference in New York City where Ian Lipkin flat out lied. We found retroviruses, here's his quote, in a public conference call with the Centers for Disease Control in 85%. Oh, wait a minute, that's exactly what Harvey Alter and Judy found. And again, it's very difficult to know whether this is clinically significant. And given the previous experience with retroviruses and chronic fatigue, I'm going to be very clear in telling you, although I'm reporting them in Professor Montoya's samples, neither he nor we have concluded. There you go. Confession, fraud. The multi-center study was fraud. Fauci stopped it. He held me from it when against all odds, we would have replicated our studies. And so don't sit here and say we didn't replicate our studies. And here's just, this goes into, oh, how long have we had reverse transcriptase in MMR? Oh, 1995. Oh, okay. What MMR? Oh, look, few viral monkey kidney cells, a little HIV, a little XMRV. Sorry. And this just goes into what a retrovirus is. And then we go on to say, oh, here's your Prerex Tetra vaccine. This is a new MMR shot, or MMR5, that the Italian independent research group of Corvalva found all these adventitious agents. They're known to be adventitious virus contaminants. And here's how the government and the WHO, adventitious agents, lessons learned from SV40, from 4 case studies. You know what the lessons learned were? Not the science of how to protect it, how to cover it up in the media, how to convince people the vaccines were safe anyway. And I'll get you these papers. It's not a problem.
I'm just curious, what year was that published? I can't see it.
2014. See, they've already taken me out. In 13 and 14, and 12 was the end of XMRVs. The death of XMRV is 12. When the multi-center study, because again, Bush was calling me while I was in Ireland. You know, are you going to do the Lipkin study? Are you going to do the Lipkin study? He knew that study wasn't powered to be an association study, that he put his senior authorship with the blood working group. He knew that was fraud. Coffin, Fauci, Coffin. The other investigators didn't necessarily know it was fraud, but Coffin and Michael Bush and Simone Glenn engineered that fraud. So again, he knew it wasn't associated. He's going to do the Lipkin study, going to do the multi-center study. So in 2014, the FDA approves cleaning up the blood supply. So you covered up that mess. And here in 2014, they're starting to talk about adventitious agents and how we're going to cover those up. 2014, and I can go into paper after paper, but this is now a paper that came out sponsored by an independent group, and it said the presence of potentially dangerous adventitious viruses which certify there's no adequate control on vaccines, because if they were, these elements would have been detected. Here's 32 proviruses. A retrovirus is 8,000 base pairs, and it intercalates into your DNA. 32 sequences of endogenous retroviruses. Equine infectious anemia virus, a little horse, anyone? That's a horribly toxic to the spleen. Avian leukosis virus, again, flu shots, birds, 2 sequences, and 4 sequences of the envelope, which of the HERV H, which I believe is a gamma HERV, but don't quote me. And the envelope would have crosstalked with XMRVs because they're gamma retroviruses. The ERV betas, these, now they're beta retroviruses. So they were saying, oh, you just detected endogenous virus. Nope, because they're not gamma, and the reagents didn't exist to look for these at the protein level. So there was no data. And then of course you've got the MRC5 cell line, which are growing the virus again, because we explained that at the beginning. And look how many micrograms per dose. 80% of the residual was human, fetal, and the other amount was chicken. Oh, coronaviruses, anyone? Just saying.
Can we just add, I just want to ask one question. In terms of the Moderna method of making the messenger RNA vaccine, are they growing that in cell lines, or are they sequencing it?
I don't know.
Like synthetically? Yeah,
I don't know if they're expressing it or growing it. I don't know how they're making all that RNA, if they're growing. And this is why in another talk I said RNA vaccines have never worked. And I didn't say RNA vaccines against RNA viruses, but those don't work either, meaning they don't develop memory or immune responses. We know that. And in fact, with measles vaccine, people won't even make antibodies. They're allergic. We can't, when FDA approves a drug called IVIG, intravenous immunoglobulin, they approve that drug based on levels of MMR and antibodies to measles. And the kids are allergic. So the only person you're going to get antibodies from is the natural immunity, and that's why I'm fighting so hard to drive the natural immunity. So here's an important part. This is the paper that Gary Owens was finally allowed to publish, and it was 2013. And it was his student, Mira, that needed to do this to get her MD, PhD. And you need to get publications to get PhDs. And so here in this paper, MLV protein alone, XMRV envelope alone, that was what our antibody test was to. Envelope alone in many, many, many other proteins induced tumor cells to promote the formation of immature blood vessels. Oh, what do you have in COVID-19? Little microvascular problem? And we know the envelope proteins in there. So here's two lines from the paper. Envelope proteins from both viruses impact tumor pathogenesis. They change the microvasculature. They similar to the vascular pathology seen in ME/CFS and vaccine injuries. COVID-19, anyone? They're just changing the name. And the microvasculature aberrations are caused solely by that protein. And there's so many of these envelope proteins that crosstalk. And here's a quote from the paper. And these people come from John Coffin's lab. Here's the other people. This journal, Retrovirology, the editor on it was Zhang, Quan Zhang. He was the second in command to Tony Fauci at the NIAID. And he theoretically killed himself in January of 2013. Maybe, I don't know. I'm not going to say. Anyway, it's in the book. All the scientists and doctors who die are in plague of corruption. So here's the quote. Although it is highly unlikely that XMRV, see, you're only allowed to call it VP62, and that's what matters in the thing. Or, you know, because it wasn't XMRV VP62. That was never in the blood. It was the XMRVs, like me and Harvey Alter said. And then B4, they changed it to B4RV because the patients wouldn't find it in a search. So they literally changed the name. Remember, I've got the sequence of it, and I've got the whole transcript from Gary Owens, because we were working with them. And in our original 67%, we gave them our entire 101 sample box. And guess what we came up with? Between XMRV1 and XMRV2, like 98%. So how many diseases have we caused? So that between this research, because I started a collaboration, actually we started a collaboration, Gary Owens and I, because we were persona non grata on November 10th at Cleveland Clinic, because we dared call John Coffin, you know, call it something he didn't let us call it, but XMRV was absolutely named on a biological level and not on a molecular sequence level as John Coffin and the fraud that was perpetrated. So it said, they, you know, although it's highly unlikely these infect humans and are pathogenic, the results suggest xenograft approach. If you inject animal tissues into humans, as in that vaccine program, that's xenograft, commonly used in the studies of human cancer, in the biological therapies. What is CAR T cell, chimeric antigen T cell receptor? You know what they make it in? An MLV vector. So just like you're saying about expressing in vectors, yeah, and then they intercalate them and they go right for TET2 and some of the methylation genes and cause the expression of everything. And these people die of all kinds of horrific tumors after they cure them with their $60 zillion CAR T cell therapy on the cover of Time magazine, the fake news between science. So it says similar viruses may have evolved to infect humans. Sure they did. We already proved that, you know, 2 years earlier, or a year earlier. And so here in February 2002, there was a draft guidance on industry that says you know, that were measures that had to be taken to reduce the possible risk of transmission of zoonosis by blood and blood products from xenotransplantation product recipients and their intimate contacts. Intimate contacts, why? Contagious. Oh, that was 2002. They withdrew it quietly in May of 2015. Oh, when did Nature publish the study saying Nature Med that the Wuhan, and then, oh, we're just gonna stop taking precautionary measures to reduce the zoonosis. John Coffin was part of these secret meetings where they said the partners of the xenos, the XMRVs, were not at risk.
The people that are listening to this, they need to pay attention to what you just said.
Yep.
This is an extremely important inflection point.
Correct. So this was the guidance, May of 2015, right when that paper came out. And he said, he sat in that meeting, Coffin, who made the infected blood go away? Who took the patent for the detection of all the XMRVs after I was fired away from me, who it belonged to, and Frank Rossetti? Oh, John Coffin. He's making a fortune testing for COVID, isn't he? Yeah, because, you know, and that's why they have to control the test. Let somebody else make the test, and I'll show you there's very little SARS-CoV-2 in COVID-19, and except unless you drove it with a flu vaccine. At any rate, here's the draft guidance, and they withdrew it in May of May 6, 2015. They withdrew it. So again, now, so they're intimate contacts. And so it's beyond, you know, corruption. And here you go again with another one that everybody will remember. Here's an Ebola. This is from NPR, Natural Public Radio News, December 1st of 2014. Viruses can spread through the air in two ways: the large droplets that quickly fall to the ground, or the second route is airborne transmission, like measles. And so this is important with the masks and with the COVID-19. Well, coronaviruses spread this way. So why are we social distancing? Oh, so they can contact us unless it was injected and not infected. At any rate, so the big droplets here. So they're showing this man coughing measles. But when the Ebola outbreak of 2014, when it was clear the doctors, Kent Brantley and the nurse, Kent Brantley, the doctor, and nurse Nancy got infected, and they were the ones that were covered in the suits and had everything on and were wiping themselves down with Clorox, it was clear the only way they could get infected with the Ebola is if it had been aerosolized. Just like the XMRVs, by working in the lab, you aerosolize them and you create them. So here's an Ebola puzzle for you. If the virus isn't airborne, why do the doctors and nurses wear the face mask and all the stuff by treating when you're treating the patients? So they just, our CDC, Centers for Disease Control, Centers for Deception and Corruption, why do they redefine contagious when it suits their purpose? And here's our friend Harold Barmas, who was the head of the NCI, National Cancer Institute, and that was a big demotion because he was the NIH director who in 1999 implemented the xenotransplantation program, which includes xenografts for cancer research, gene therapy, as I mentioned a minute ago. Barmas also started the NIH vaccine research program, which we now know funds, everything, 1999. So, and he admitted right here, viruses that are not pathogenic in their natural host reservoirs. Oh, the bat, anyone? That's where Ebola comes from, the little bats and the little civettes and the little mink focus forming virus, maize and Pfizer kidney cells, maize and Pfizer virus, sorry. In some cases, highly pathogenic when transmitted to a new host species. Several zoonotic viruses produce significant outbreaks when introduced into human hosts under normal circumstances of exposure: influenza, hantavirus, Ebola. But why does hantavirus goes away? Because it kills the people. And it can't adapt to infect the cells without killing them. And that's what we teach it to do in the laboratory. That's why Vero monkey kidney cells, that's why it can't possibly be a natural evolution, because the people die. And that's why it takes so many years. This one came a quick 10 years after SARS. Consequently, this recipient of the xenotran is at risk for infectious agents already known to be transmissible from animals to humans, the XMRVs, as well as infectious agents, which may become transmissible only through xenotransplantation. Injecting them into immune-compromised people, little babies and old people, and the infected xenograft recipients could transmit these infectious agents to their contact or to the public at large. So that's why they're going to start contact controlling and supposedly saving us from ourselves. But in fact, the families, and all my work was always in family studies, always translational biology, ever since the Biological Response Modifier program in 1983 to 1987. So we don't need to go over how corrupt vaccine court is, because this is more of the same of the plague of corruption, of why they're calling things that aren't due to a coronavirus, COVID-19, burying the people, injecting them quick, killing them with those sudden cardiac events. All those people with the 32 diseases will be the first to die. And if people get the flu shot at the end of the summer, then they're going to have COVID-19 in the fall. Please, 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 not another shot. I don't care what you think about me, but if every American stands up and says, we're not getting a flu shot at the end of the summer, we're not going to drive your, it's coming back, so that they destroy our economy again. Open up. We've got a natural herd immunity. It's clear. Take off the mask. You're you're only hurting yourself. And so this was a lie from the February 27th and 28th meeting of the ACIP, the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. And so I wasn't allowed to testify. They had a lottery, and I never lose it. I never win that lottery to speak, I guarantee you. They didn't even want to let me in the building, but they had.
Let me just do an anecdotal, just a real quick anecdotal.
No,
So for medical school,
you
for medical school, you have to obviously get your vax shots, right?
Right.
You know, so what I noticed is when my antibodies were low for Hep B,
Right.
I had to get another Hep B, shot. It's 3 shots. All right. So after the second shot, within 2 weeks, I play tennis. So my wrist is sometimes gets sore from tennis. But what I noticed, and I haven't played tennis in a while because of this whole locked, sheltered in place.
Sure.
But 2 weeks after getting that Hep B shot, I started getting arthritis in my right wrist.
Inflammation.
2 weeks. Yep, it was 2 weeks, and I didn't have any problems. None until that happened.
And it's the aluminum in that shot. In the beginning, they were made in human plasma, so I'm sure they were transmitting HIVs and XMRVs, because the first group in the 90s, in the early 90s, weren't recombinant. So I'm sure they were giving people, they were killing people, and this is what the band played on. That what did we force the gays, the IV drug users? Oh, Hep B shots. We drove the disease and we killed them, just like if you get a flu shot right now, they will kill you. Might not be tomorrow, but they will call it COVID. So
well, that's another thing is that, they forced the annual flu vaccine on these.
We have to, this is why. This is, and we don't need any of this, but this is why, this is President Trump's call to action.
Yep.
Stop it. A 5-year moratorium on all vaccines. And what you're going to see is, hey, we don't need them. We got wonderful food. We got great natural product medicines. And we've got a fabulous, close the CDC, FDA, and NIH. Convict these people for crimes against humanity. Take all those royalties and give it back to the victims of this 35-year plague of corruption. So isn't it interesting that, that's why, God has a sense of humor. That's why I'm laughing. End all mandates and restore liability. It's clear the vaccines aren't safe. It's clear because they've never been tested. Can't say they're efficacious because they've never been tested. Can't say anything I'm saying is not true because they've never looked. If you look for your keys under the light post, that's exactly what you'll find. So they're calling this COVID-19. Let me have the test. Let me see if there are XMRVs in there or YZRVs or a little Borrelia or a little Mycoplasma or Mo.
Well, you bring up a great point. Several points. One is that they never test the long-term effects of vaccines. They don't test the synergistic effects when you're adding all these vaccines together, especially with children.
Right, correct.
But
that's required by law. And that's what I did. If I added a single drug to a protocol, remember I said I made adriamycin. So when we did things like full Ferrinox, the Fox things for pancreatic cancer. In order to add a cisplatin to an adriamycin, different classes of drugs, you had to test singly and together and combined. So every one individually and then combined to look for those synergistic effects. And in fact, you had to develop that way. Do you know how they develop twin Ricks to get yourself another patent? They do hepatitis A and hepatitis B. One's recombinant with a boatload of aluminum, and the other's a live viral vaccine grown in, I don't even know what, animal tissue right now, but different manufacturers. And then they don't extract them and and get them together. They take them unilaterally and they just mix them together and they don't clean them up at all. And so there was an investigator, and I opine in Vaccine Corp, and I showed the drug development of this because God has a sense of humor. I know these 4 fields, So and I said there, and he said in the paper said, I'm surprised that there are more side effects with Trinwix than with either alone. No, because it's synergies. You're compounding. It's not additive. You're getting synergistic toxicities because you never looked at it and you just threw it all in the gamish because there's no liability and you can. So I think you see the reason why they have to shut me up is because, nobody saw all of these avenues of drug development. Mostly people do one thing their whole life and they do it really well. And so for us, it's always translational. It's understand how a virus affects the immune system, no matter what virus, what's the disease signature, and then what natural product therapies will heal it, or what diagnostic strategies like the Cirrus technology to clean up the blood. They can't clean up the vaccines or they'll lose the antigens because they're all little viruses. So if we use a nanomolar filter, you'll take them all away.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And see, this is their problem. They covered their ass on the contaminated blood supply, got rid of me, said I'm crazy. And had they gotten away with the perfect crime, locked down the labs, and again, Tony Fauci paid for it. It's clear. He directed the destruction because he gave the Whittemores the grants. So he gave the investigators. That's how you could say he planned it.
If you were given the opportunity,
Mm-hmm.
where someone wrote you a big check, all right, and said, we're going to make a lab. What do you need to do to prove, that SARS-CoV-2, we have a problem here. Houston, we have a problem. Mm-hmm. How much money are you talking about here?
Well, I think the whole lab exists. And as I think the people and the personnel, I could point them out. I don't need to build a new lab. We know exactly what they are and how to do it. And the simple thing to do is, as I always said, is heal it. We can make a safe vaccine. So this moratorium and repealing the 1986 National Vaccine Injury Compensation Pro. Yes, David.
You come or you gonna
Can I come where, sweetie pie? You mean 5 more minutes?
Yeah.
5 more minutes.
So I'll go get the pizza. It's ready.
Okay, perfect. You go and come back and I'll ride over to Joanne.
Okay.
No, we're not going over there till 5, sweetie pie.
Oh, I thought it was 4.
No, 5, honey.
Oh,
Okay, take your time. Go ahead on. No, go get it. It's ready. I'll see you in a little while. Sorry, my husband's getting dinner for my West Coast mom is 86. So if we shelter in place, we'll kill my West Coast mom, and my husband's 81. So we'll kill him too. So we're making sure no mask. He's out in the sunshine. We're riding our bikes.
Right.
From our sweatshirts. Not going to kill my family again.
Well, I'll tell you what, when I've been sheltering in place for quite a while in New York, and I just started to regularly walk in the morning outside, and I'll tell you, I feel so much better.
Go outside.
Just mentally, physically, my legs, were atrophying, so now I can walk outside. But everyone that's outside, they got their mask. They're even jogging with their mask, which is stupid.
It's going to kill them. So I encourage you to look at the highwire.com from today and maybe interview a Professor Cahill, a woman from somewhere in the UK or Ireland, Cahill. I forgot her first name, but I saw the show before coming to do this with you. Oh man, she did such a beautiful job. I think I can email it to you, the links to the talk. She did such a beautiful job of showing even, I think it's Dr. Blaylock's work from Texas, because he's corroborated long before I did any of this stuff. See, I did not know vaccines were involved until 2014. So I'm thinking blood supply. All our work was blood supply. Yes, that microbiology paper was out there, but I don't think that in our first book, Plague, I don't think the word vaccine was said more than once or twice. And in the second book, obviously, with everything I just showed you, this was a walk through the second book, and it's all over it. So if you get her video there and a chance to talk to her, she and Dr. Blaylock talk about the immune suppression of the mask. It literally will suppress CD4, those helper T cells, for an adaptive memory immune response beyond suffocation. And so, yes, sheltering in place. My husband has COPD. He was perfectly healthy before this. You can hear him wheeze now. You can hear IL-6 is a powerful cytokine, and you know it's at the center of this. IL-6 is a very powerful cytokine for driving the cytokine signature of COVID-19, and that's depression. That's seasonal affective disorder. That's get out in the sunshine, get out in the beach, exercise, walk, run.
Get the D3. Get that D3.
Get the D3
absolutely.
for the immune response. And so there's so much more. So you got more than your hour.
I appreciate this. You know,
Close to 2.5 hours.
I mean, there's a lot of content here, and you have an amazing amount to share, everybody.
Yeah.
But for
simply when they do these fact checking. So what I did when Martin Enserink sent me an email, oh, dear Dr. Judy, I hope you're doing well. Sure you do. You just destroyed my career with your fake science news. Oh, sure you do. I'd love to interview you about your movie Plandemic and what you said there and blah, and your plague of, and all I did was I sent him Plague of Corruption. I just hit the reply button and I hit Plague of Corruption and this talk and said, here's my comment. You know,
just before parting, two questions, or three, really short though. What is your understanding of Duke University in this whole development program? Do you know of anything that from your understanding?
I don't know much except for some of the big wigs in HIV and in you know, some of those issues are at Duke, and there's a great deal of funding in retroviruses and experience, and they're right there next to drug companies like GSK and then Gilead. So both GSK and Gilead came to me right after the discovery of the paper, and they were hot on it to, you know, to make drugs. And of course, we know remdesivir and the Gilead drugs. Oh, how interesting that, that you know, that this is the drug that's the standard of care rather than the ones that these people don't have the patents on.
Well, what's interesting is that one of the big VC companies, venture capitalist companies, comes from China, and he's the grandson of the prior president of China through a company called Baiwu Capita. And they own a company that owns big shares in Gilead. So it's very weird what's going on with remdesivir and following the money trail.
Yeah, following the money trail, and it becomes very weird, and that's the real I mean, the entire system needs to come down. The grants fund the publications, the people are being paid, you know, grants they haven't earned as principal investigators. So look, all the grants that pop up, and who's controlling the grants? Oh, NIAID, it's an infectious disease. It's COVID, so $6 billion that Fauci controls, and even keeping the therapies away. That's why I said FDA, you know, yeah, they're keeping type 1 interferon, which can prevent the zoonosis, and all you need to do is put it in the feed of the animals. And yet they stopped that 40 years ago. And when you make a supplement, you're not even allowed to call it interferon. You're supposed to call it bovine protein, because they won't. So think about how the FDA won't let you make label claims about something, and they get to decide efficacy. No, they were set up in the 60s, 62 or so, for safety. Well, glyphosate isn't safe. GMOs aren't safe, you know, so they're not doing their job, and yet they're telling me who made the drugs and made the discoveries of interferon, interleukin-2, IL-15, HO. They're telling me I can't use the drug where I see fit, or discuss with doctors, other practitioners who see my work and say, hey, you know, and this is what we do. We're an education company. So when the doctors read our papers, they're like, yeah, I'm going to treat with GC-MAF. That's how Jeffrey Bradstreet died. You know, it's gamma globulin macrophage activating factor, and we now know it's a macrophage modulating factor. So when I said that Tony Fauci and NIAID kept therapeutics from going into it, peptide T. What did peptide T modulate? Oh, CCR5. It prevented the interaction of the macrophage and the T cell. And what did it work in all the way back in the 80s? What was the control group? CFS, where there's no XMRV. The problem is peptide T worked on both. So was XMRV all there all along? Yep. So, you know, you've got 40 years of crimes. And that's why that's why they're afraid if XMRV works out. And Tony Fauci has led this for the whole 35 years, not just me, destroyed Elaine DeFreitas. You know, the book Osler's Web tells you everything. Another investigator that dare isolate a retrovirus and associate it with HIV, but then she called it, I mean, with CFS, but then she called it HTLV1-like because the only reagents you had were for deltas and lentis. We didn't have gamma retroviruses except for that box of reagent Frank's wife had because she worked on them their whole life. So when the discoveries are allowed to be made instead of censored science and covered up science, and the only people who get the grants are the people who won't discover anything. So they give a bunch of kids nothing. They fire all the old people except for themselves. And they run, you know, the people who could really see something out of science. And because they don't want you to see it, you know, and that's the plague of corruption.
So from your perspective, what's the best way to take all this knowledge and just stab the heart of Fauci and have him convicted?
Right here, convict the criminals, close the CDC for reorganization, close the FDA now, close the NIAID, remove Fauci. Anybody over 65 is gone. You know, get rid of them. They're all, you know, they're all ancient. They haven't they haven't worked in clinical medicine. They're perpetrating frauds over and over and over again. These are convicts. Birx, Redfield, you know, the FDA heads, these are convicts. They're convicted felons. They've perpetrated this fraud in HIV, in CFS for 4 decades, and in autism, you know, and then bring back the good people, bring the people with some knowledge, let them reorganize. We've got all the technology, we've got all the skills. Start over with honest people who genuinely care. Let everybody be equal. Naturopathic doctors, chiropractic doctors, supplements, drugs, insurance cover, and health insurance. Just give that tax deductible $5,000 a year and you can spend it any way you want. You can hire the car mechanic you want to fix your car. If you like a Mercedes-Benz dealer for your Chevrolet, that's up to you. This is what we need to change. So doing this, you know, advisory committee on immunization, this is like an ad hoc throw anything in we want, you know, at the CDC. And the drug manufacturers know they don't work, and they don't test them, and they just say, oh, we recommended it. And that's why I showed that ACIP meeting and how fraudulent it is, because these people out and out lie throughout that meeting. And thehighwire.com, you know, Del Bigtree, he's shown it. He was at that February 27th meeting. People all over, you know, Barbara Lowe Fisher, Dr. Suzanne Humphreys, all of these people who, you know, skill sets. Stephanie Seneff, I had Stephanie Seneff, and close the EPA too. So Stephanie Seneff reorganizes the FDA because she's the expert on glyphosate and toxicities and GMOs and these things, along with a bunch of other people. I put up there David Lewis, EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency whistleblower. He wrote the book Science for Sale. You'd want to talk to him in one of your talks. And, you know, just simply close the CDC. They're doing nothing but killing us. And you save $1 billion. You know, the HHS is a third of our gross national. You could fix all of this if President Trump did this tomorrow. Everybody go back outside. Everybody go back to their jobs. The clinical data support that. You're not going to catch it. It doesn't aerosolize. Remember my little droplets? You don't have to stand 6 feet apart. In order to get a natural immunity, you have to hug each other. And if something's airborne, you're not going to suck in a vacuum cleaner full of SARS-CoV-2, and it's going to go right through that mask. You're going to get a couple of particles on your skin. You're going to get a natural booster like we do to all the tetanus strains in the sand and in the earth. You know, natural boosters for shingles and chickenpox. That was your taking care of your grandchildren when you were having chickenpox parties, and old people didn't get shingles. You don't need a vaccine. And the failure of that vaccine program and many others are in the forward that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. made for our book. And he walked through as an environmental lawyer. He heard what I said, giving this kind of talk to him last October. He heard what I said, and the light bulb went on, and I didn't know half of what was in that forward. And so Ronald Goldman was the whistleblower on the chickenpox vaccine. They took him out, stopped his funding. That's how you win. You stop the funding. You don't get publications, you don't get funding, you don't have a job. So it's just that they couldn't stop me because until that embattled institute got to keep their grants. How were they embattled? Oh, they'd committed all these crimes, misappropriate millions of dollars of fund, and they got paid big money for it. And we've got the FBI. We've talked to them on 3 different occasions on tapes. That's the big gotcha at the end of the book. So I encourage everybody to read the book, and that's why, ordinary people are waking up, because ordinary people are waking up. This is a simple book. It takes 3 hours to read. And it's like I talked to you just now. It's not like Plague, where it's a science book. It's much more sciencey in detail. This is the plague of corruption. This has nothing to do with science, and neither does COVID-19.
Well, this is what I like. This is what I like about the 2 works that you've published, for the masses. Let's put it that way. Is that it's for scientists and
Correct.
For the layman.
Correct.
And I think that's a really important way to articulate this whole big thing that's happening. I've been mentioning on my channel for a while now about this idea of the Biopatriot Act, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like 9/11 instituted the Patriot Act, and we started losing our civil liberties from it. So
Correct.
this virus, this pandemic,
Yeah.
is they're going to start instituting laws where I call the Biopatriot Act, and we're going to start losing our civil liberties, and
we've got martial law out there.
Right. The question is what
near our studio. We have a 1-room here.
Yeah, I mean, what the question is at what point does the American citizens get out and start protesting? Because I'm a firm believer that there's an awful lot of women that have children that are very scared on a forced vaccine program where they say, here's the vaccine for SARS-CoV-2.
Yeah.
And I don't think I think there's a lot of women that are going to say, you are not putting that in my child.
Right. And the testing. You're not coming into my house for your little contact program. And this is where civil disobedience, it's now. We've got to tell them, we don't care what you say. You can't arrest us all like Elon Musk said. No, I'm opening my country and file suits. Now, he's got the money to do it. What about the rest of us? We've got to stand up and peaceably mix on the beach. It'll be easy. We won't get sick. Look at me. They infected me with a boatload of XMRV like every other lab worker. I had a boatload of protein, a boatload, and I'm fine. You know why? Because we've got the solutions. Doesn't matter if they get infected, folks, and that's what all the data said. Asymptomatic carriers are healthy people who've cleared the virus. So listen to Professor Cahill, and she said yesterday, people need to go back out, take off the mask, go hug people. I mean, I hate to hug people, and now I have to hug everybody because somebody told me I can't. It's like, oh man, my husband's happy because it's like, honey, don't hug me. I just don't like to be touched. My nephews, we just wave. We've never been huggy people, and now I have to hug. It's like, oh man, just when somebody tells me I can't do something, forget that. So fortunately, I've always been that way, and I really don't care what anybody tells me. I do care when they lie. I do care. That science article, no, that's not fact checking. I sent him the book and the 2 talks. Explain it to me, will you? That's the timeline. That's the proof. And that's the thing. When I said on that, what was my exact quote on that in that press conference? It isn't there. We all had to agree it was never in the plasma. What was the it? VP62, the only thing we were allowed to call XMRV, which never was the virus. So Abbott and Silverman lose their patent. Mikovitz and Rossetti have it. And it's trillions of dollars. And the Whittemore-Peterson Institute made one little mistake. They didn't have a written contract with Judy Mikovitz. They had a handshake, because Judy's Mikovitz is her word, is what is my contract. And so they had to fabricate one after they fired me, so that they made sure they could say I stole their intellectual property. You know what? I developed that cytokine signature in 1999. You know, that would have been my patent, but again, you know, they tried to take every, you know, and they would have gotten away for it with, but one thing, and Max Post is really the hero, and they ruined his life as well because he caught them. That would have been the perfect crime. They would have said it was all gone, and they would have filed that fraudulent lawsuit, which was pure fraud. And I've got the original affidavits from that. They pulled it magically out after they filed it because the judge was corrupt, bought and paid for, recused himself, March of 2012. Why were those criminal charges held? Why wasn't everybody told this then? Well, because NIH still had a little problem, XMRVs. And I put the S on it, and I always will. I called it human gamma retroviruses, because there are lots of them. They come from monkeys, they come from birds, they come from mice, and they come directly from xenotransplantation, which is injection. It's not infection.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's the amount of information that you shared with the channel, I greatly appreciate, and the amount of time that you allocated today, I greatly appreciate. So for women that are thinking about going into medicine or going into, let's say, a graduate studies or a PhD in biology or chemistry, what would you have to say to inspire them?
Well, I mean, I mean, first thing that has to end is the corrupt old boys network. There's no more misogyny in all the world. I mean, forget about people, you know, grabbing your ass. I think that's what I said after Trump. You know, I don't care if he grabs my ass. Don't force the injection of my child. You know, I don't give a shit. His locker room talk cheap. Look what they've done to women. Who are the victims of this? The working mothers. So women in science, you know, it's good. I mean, it's good, but you have to do what I did. And that's the blessing of my entire life is that I worked my entire life, my entire adult life, save 3 years, you know, with the scientists of the utmost integrity and brilliance. And that is Frank Rossetti. And so that, you know, I'm thankful for because women are abused. So I would say, yes, do it. But maintain your integrity at all times and recognize, you know, it's the hard thing to do is recognize these journals are fraud. But if we take down this entire system and we put women in charge, women of integrity of charge, and not this corrupt old boys network, this plague of corruption perpetrated by this corrupt old boys network that started in at least, you know, 1984 and never ever died. So yeah, there are many, and it's not just women, many great scientists, you know, and they're fabulous. We've got the discoveries, we've got the you know, the solid things. All we really have to do is change the system, and this goes a long way to starting it, along with, as I've said, I didn't think about it in this talk, but end the Bayh-Dole Act, because the BAYH, Senator Bob Dole Act of the early 80s, allowing universities, investigators who receive taxpayer money, who are funded by the taxpayers, to patent their work. It doesn't belong to them, it belongs to the public. Then the drug prices will go down. Then nobody will care about the patents, and we can simply use the therapies that work. The plants, you know, the naturopathic doctors, the chiropractic doctors, the doctors of osteopathy, you know, on and on and on. When we all work together, the energetic therapies, light therapies can change this. And like Royal Rife and Energies, we can cure cancer, you know, last week. And so what we do is buy up things and throw them on the shelf so we can continue this because there's no liability. You don't need a commercial. You know, you've got a mandate. So I'd say to young women and men everywhere, you know, be aware and fight for it. And hopefully, I mean, I wouldn't go into medicine the way it is. I wouldn't have done it again. And it didn't exist when I went into medicine. It changed after I went into medicine. The old boys plague of corruption existed. And that's why, you know, I didn't get into medical school. I had a chemistry teacher that was frustrated and didn't want women in medical school in the late 70s. And so we were a pioneering class. I was only the second class ever of women to go to the undergraduate arts and sciences of University of Virginia. The first class had among luminaries in it, Katie Couric. So, you know, so that was a tough nut to crack of the professors, the male professors who did not want women in medical school or women in science. So, you know, it didn't matter. I ended up doing what I intended to do anyway, which was, you know, heal people through medicine and plants. And we continue to do that to this day by simply educating people, educating students. We've got to change everything. That what's being taught in our schools isn't immunology I just taught, it's fraud. It's a scientific commercial propaganda masquerading as science. So I'm sure you've seen on my Twitter account the New Orleans mask with my hat that says "I hope," a blue hat. And it's a mask from New Orleans. It's like, you know, the Lone Ranger. It's propaganda masquerading as science, and we need to end all of it. And it's a big chore, and we might not win, but if we don't win before they start this, you know, if we don't win today, you know, the woman, Professor Cahill, beautiful, brilliant, right there. I can think of so many others, Liz Blackburn, Nobel laureate for telomeres, and other people. It's not the people, it's not the men or the women, it's the corruption at the top. And they stop everything, much the way a lot of very honest scientists who I work with my whole life knew I did nothing wrong, but they turned away because they were afraid. And, you know, I can't lose. I can't afford to see a mugshot. I can't afford to lose my family like Jeff Bradstreet, you know, had to be suicided because, you know, his whole family, his 2 sons and his new wife were threatened, on and on and on. And all of those people are in the book. So, you know, I say God has a sense of humor because, you know, I met my husband when I was 40 years old at a scientific meeting out here in California. And I was so sick of the corruption that I left. I had discovered another virus that I, at the time, had called human herpes virus 9. And I now know it to be Epstein-Barr virus with a retrovirus integrated in it. So it's a super transforming Epstein-Barr virus. And I wish I had some of those samples because probably now it's part of the XMRVs that why we see people with mononucleosis and with, you know, those keep popping up because remember that War and Peace among the microbes, you know, viruses rare and pathogens rarely travel alone. That paper was just about pathogens, but we appreciate Borrelia, Babesia, you know, things like that. And so there's a lot. I mean, you know, the technology, the wisdom, the genetics, the genomics, you know, if women could get there, and I do have several good friends and many good friends. Mary Carrington made the genetic discoveries as, you know, leading the team for CCR5 deletion, for why certain people could have all the XMRV floating around their bodies as long as their macrophages didn't get infected. And that was what my PhD thesis was. So, you know, you have the corrupt old boy saying in that Science article, oh, her PhD didn't, we talked to people and it didn't change anything. Well, you know what? After 1991, it changed, didn't it? You don't hear of it anymore, do you?
And that's the thing is that, you know, for PhDs, you know, it's about the passion of learning something in a particular subject, but adding a grain to the mountain of knowledge.
Right.
And you know, and people get this ego.
Yeah. That grain has to change everything. If it doesn't shift a paradigm, you don't get a PhD. It's not a memorize. That's a master's degree.
Yeah.
PhD is
Right.
what change? What do you educate? And we educate. In vaccine court once I wrote because the MDs are considered the experts. And I said, oh, they practice what we teach. They practice what we discovered.
Oh, yeah, right.
Interleukin
Right,
5,
right.
interleukin 15, and that the we is Frank Rossetti and I, epigenetics, DNA methylation modulation by retrovirus is mine, NF kappa B translocating into the nucleus, got to keep it out of there, got to keep it down, or you get inflammatory diseases, including COVID. None of that was, that's done by PhDs. That's not what MDs do. And even MD PhDs do clinical research. They don't change a paradigm. And so that program cheapened things as well, because then people do 3 years or 5 years and get 2 degrees, and it's not, you're not really getting, because you're just learning how to do clinical studies. So maybe it's okay, because maybe you learn how to use low dose interferon or low dose highly active antiretroviral therapy, because our paper said things needed to change, but somebody had to work out the change clinically, and that would be an MD PhD who clinically works it out in a study. So that's fine there, but yeah, it's time we use all the skills of all the people, and not censored, no more censored science. And this, when I came to work, there was no such thing as impact factor of a journal. Does that mean that's the most highly censored, most fraudulent propaganda journal like Science and Nature? We see how they're skewing the discussion. So they're inviting the papers. And if you drink the Kool-Aid and you take the money and you take the fame and you take that paper in October of 2009 should have given me a Nobel Prize. It should have set my career up forever. And it destroyed it nearly killed me, and it destroyed my economic life and cost me every penny I ever made. I'm sitting in a 1-room apartment here, and we've moved 10 times. 10 times in the decade since all of this happened. So, I don't know that I'd encourage anybody go in science the way it is, but I'd encourage everybody to try.
Well, I think people view you as a hero. I really do. There are many, many people that view you as an icon to look up to. And, so even though, you've seen a lot of darkness through this whole ordeal,
right,
and maybe still, seeing that, just remember that people view you a lot of people view you in a very, very positive light. And we are blessed, literally blessed with the knowledge that you're giving to people based on your experience, and we all appreciate it.
Well, thanks so much, Paul. I really appreciate you and you inviting me to talk to you, and open-minded to look at, because our truth is all what is real, is all how we view the world based on our experiences. So all we can do is all we can do, and you don't know what you don't know.
Right. Well, thank you very much for coming onto the channel and sharing a wealth of knowledge. And if there's anything that I can do in the future, reach out. If you ever want to, come onto the channel and just talk.
I hope we'll stay in touch.
Yeah,
and
definitely.
Once the firestorm of, the latest stuff goes away. So
right, because this is, I know you're very, very busy, with everything that's going on. But as things start to die down,
then we can have some fun and do some real science.
Right.
Open minds, and that's the most fun for me.
Exactly. Well, thank you very, very much. Let me hit the stop the record and here.
And I'll exit to stop sharing. And then I have to go to dinner.